Deep in America's wilderness, park rangers stand watch over millions of acres of untamed land. But some things in those forests were never meant to be found. Strange disappearances, unexplained sounds in the dark, encounters that defy all logic. These are the stories they don't put in the reports. Welcome to Mr. Bellicho, where the woods remember everything. I've spent 17 years managing the forests and trails of West Virginia. I've documented wildlife migrations, tracked endangered species populations, and filed countless reports on ecological changes. This account exists because I believe the truth, however difficult to present through official channels, deserves witness. What happened in Point Pleasant wasn't an isolated incident. It was a convergence, a moment when something ancient decided to make itself known, and I was the only one fool enough or brave enough to follow it into the darkness. My name is Marcus Colton. I'm a ranger, not a storyteller, but stories like this one demand to be told even if no one believes them. The November air had turned bitter by the time I received the call about unusual disturbances near the TNT area outside Point Pleasant. That's what locals called it, the TNT, a sprawling stretch of abandoned World War II munitions plant surrounded by dense forest and overgrown wetlands. The location made people nervous. There was something about that place that historical records couldn't quite explain away, something that lingered in the soil and water long after the government had moved on. The initial reports came through standard channels: missing livestock, strange tracks along the creek bed, and a few unclear photographs taken by hunters who swore they'd seen something not quite right moving between the trees. In my experience, not quite right usually meant black bears at unusual hours or a coyote pack expanding its territory. West Virginia's wilderness held no shortage of explanations for unexplained phenomena, and I'd learned to approach mystery with skepticism and methodology. But there was something about the tone of the callers that troubled me. They didn't sound confused, they sounded afraid. One woman, whose name I later learned was Patricia, described an encounter near the creek in halting words. She'd been walking her dog at dusk when something moved across the path in front of her. She couldn't describe it, not wouldn't, but couldn't. Her voice had wavered as she told me it was too big and the wings didn't move right. Then she'd hung up. I drove out to Point Pleasant on a Friday afternoon, the mountains already deep in their autumn collapse. The leaves had finished their transformation into brown remnants that clung to branches like regrets. My truck, a weathered Chevy that had seen better decades, navigated the winding roads with the familiarity of routine. I'd made this drive hundreds of times over my career, and it never failed to settle something restless in me. The TNT area was isolated, which was why I preferred to investigate reports there during the early hours before dark. The abandoned plant stretched across the landscape like the skeleton of some Cold War creature, its concrete bunkers half hidden by advancing forest growth. Nature was patient here. Over 60 years it had begun the long process of reclamation. Vines creeping up the structures, trees growing through gaps in the concrete. I parked near the ranger station and gathered my equipment: binoculars, camera, notebook, and a flashlight. The sun was already angling low, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that felt less beautiful and more ominous. I made notes about the reported sightings, marking them on my map. Most clustered around the wetland areas near the creek, perfect habitat for wildlife of all kinds: beavers, muskrats, waterfowl, even black bears, though they were less common in November as they entered their pre-hibernation phase. The first hour of my investigation turned up nothing remarkable. I found animal tracks, mostly deer and raccoon, and some displaced vegetation near the creek bed, consistent with recent wildlife activity. The photographs the hunters had taken were stored on their phones, and while I couldn't see them in person, the descriptions suggested nothing more exotic than a large animal caught at a poor angle in inadequate light. The human mind is remarkably efficient at transforming the familiar into the strange when fear is involved. It was around 5 o'clock when I noticed something that made me stop. Near a shallow part of the creek, where water pooled and slowed, there was a pattern of disturbance in the silt and mud. It wasn't a bear track. The impression was too broad, and the pattern suggested something with a different weight distribution. I knelt down, studying the mark carefully, roughly 5 feet across, with what might have been claw marks or talons radiating from a central point. I photographed it carefully, maintaining scale reference with my boot beside it, and made detailed notes. Whatever had left this mark was large, and it had descended hard onto the bank as if landing. The impression faced the forest, not the creek, Something had come down here from above. The thought should have seemed ridiculous. There were no raptors in West Virginia large enough to leave such a mark. The largest eagle on record here had a wingspan of roughly 7 feet, and their feet were adapted for grasping fish, not creating impressions like this. Yet as I stood there in the cooling afternoon, I felt a familiar tension in my shoulders, the feeling you get when you realize the familiar landscape might contain something you don't have a framework for understanding. I pushed the feeling aside and continued my patrol, making my way deeper into the TNT area. The bunkers rose up around me like partial graves, their concrete surfaces weathered and stained. I'd walked these paths hundreds of times, and the geometry of the place never became less unsettling. The bunkers created unexpected shadows, sight lines that shifted depending on your angle, and pockets of cold air that seemed to drift down from nowhere. The forest here was different from the open hiking trails and maintained parks of my usual patrol area. This was wild in a way that required management by neglect. I passed between towering oaks and hickories, their trunks wide enough that 3 people couldn't have wrapped their arms around them. The understory was dense, layers of saplings, shrubs, and the skeletal remains of summer vegetation. In summer, this place would be virtually impenetrable. Now, with winter approaching, some of that density had fallen away, creating pathways that might not be there come spring. It was in a clearing between 2 of the larger bunkers that I saw the bird. No, that's not quite right. Bird implies a category of understanding that doesn't apply. It was perched on the concrete lip of a bunker roof, roughly 40 feet away, silhouetted against the darkening sky, and it was large, impossibly large. I froze immediately, years of wildlife training taking over. When you encounter an animal you don't recognize, you don't make sudden movements, you observe, you assess threat level, you document. My hand moved slowly to my camera and I raised it, zooming the lens to maximum. The shape became clearer through the viewfinder. Wings, massive, extending easily 10 feet on either side of what might have been a torso. The wings were folded now, but the span of them was still enormous. The head was wrong though. Too large, too angular. There was something almost human about it, but distorted, stretched, with features that didn't quite align with what a head should be. I took several photographs, my hands surprisingly steady despite the way my heart had begun hammering against my ribs. The creature didn't move. It simply sat there, perched on the bunker, watching me. I was certain of that. It was watching. Even from this distance, even in the failing light, I could feel the weight of its attention. Then slowly it unfolded its wings. The motion was not like a bird taking flight. Birds have a certain jerkiness to their movements, a rapid progression from rest to action. This was deliberate, languid, almost meditative. The wings extended inch by inch, revealing a span that seemed to defy the laws of physics when applied to something that could actually exist in a solid, material form. The wingspan had to be at least 12 feet, maybe more. The wings themselves were dark, but with a texture that suggested something like chitin or scaled leather rather than feathers. My finger was on the camera shutter, but I'd stopped taking photographs. I was simply watching, jaw clenched, trying to process what my eyes were reporting to my brain. The creature raised its head slightly, and in that moment, even across 40 feet of darkening forest, I saw the eyes. They were large, reflective, golden or amber-colored, and they were looking directly at me. I don't know how long we stayed like that. Time becomes elastic in moments of genuine fear, stretching and compressing unpredictably. It might have been seconds, it might have been minutes. What I know is that my survival instinct, that ancient part of the brain that predates reason and language, was screaming at me to run. I didn't run. That's perhaps the bravest or most foolish thing I've ever done, and I'm still not certain which. Instead, I lowered my camera slowly and took a single step backward. The creature on the bunker didn't move. It simply continued watching with those enormous golden eyes. I took another step back, then another, moving slowly, carefully, maintaining eye contact in that universal way that suggests non-aggression to predators. I was perhaps 30 feet away when it happened. The wings snapped shut with a sound like enormous fabric being furled, and the creature launched itself into the air. But it didn't fly away. It flew upward, gaining altitude, its wings moving in that wrong, deliberate way. It climbed higher and higher, circling once over the clearing, and then it moved west, over the forest canopy, its silhouette disappearing against the darkening purple of the sky. I stood there for a long time after it vanished, my breathing shallow, my legs unsteady. It was only when the sun dipped below the tree line and the temperature began to drop noticeably that I forced myself to move. I gathered my equipment with shaking hands, deleted the photographs I'd taken, I'm still not sure why, and made my way back toward the ranger station. By the time I reached my truck, full darkness had descended. The stars were beginning to emerge, bright and indifferent, and I sat in the cab with my hands on the steering wheel, trying to construct a narrative that made sense. Misidentification was possible. Some large eagle I couldn't identify. A trick of light and shadow. A psychological response to the isolated location and the evening's fading visibility. I'd seen people in fear do remarkable things to the evidence of their own senses. But as I drove out of the TNT area, back toward the small town of Point Pleasant with its warm lights and ordinary reality, I knew I was lying to myself. What I'd seen existed. Whatever it was real. It was here. And now that I'd seen it, I understood that those initial reports, Patricia's terrified voice, the hunter's photographs, the inexplicable tracks, they'd all been genuine expressions of something that walked, or flew, through the darkness of West Virginia's wilderness. I had no idea then that seeing it once would mean I'd never fully escape it again, that the encounter would crack open something in my understanding of what was possible, leaving me unable to unsee what I'd witnessed. I only knew that as I drove into Point Pleasant, I had photographs I'd deleted, a story no one would believe, and the beginning of an obsession that would reshape everything about my life. I didn't report what I'd seen. That decision, made in the rational light of morning, felt both prudent and cowardly. There's a professional cost to reporting something like that, a mark against your credibility, questions about your mental state, the slow corrosion of respect among colleagues. I'd seen it happen to rangers who'd filed unusual reports. They became cautionary tales, their observations immediately subjected to skepticism that transcended the normal healthy doubt applied to unexplained phenomena. Instead, I began a private investigation. I told myself it was nothing more than due diligence, a thorough follow-up to the initial complaint calls. But the truth was more complicated. I needed to understand what I'd seen, and I needed to do it outside the framework of official record-keeping. Over the next 2 weeks, I spent my off hours reviewing historical records of the Point Pleasant area. There was far more documentation of unusual incidents than I'd expected, scattered across decades. The local historical society had files that no one seemed to actively maintain, old newspapers, journals from longtime residents, even a few academic papers that had been published in journals I'd never heard of. The through line was consistent. Unexplained wildlife reports, animal mutilations, strange sightings, all clustering around the TNT area and the broader region surrounding Point Pleasant. What fascinated me most was the timeline. The incidents weren't random. They followed patterns. There would be a period of activity, sightings, strange occurrences, a building sense of dread in the community, followed by a quiet period, sometimes lasting months or even years. Then it would start again, usually triggered by some event or condition that varied from cycle to cycle. I found references to a major series of incidents in the 1960s, well documented because they'd received attention from journalists and amateur paranormal investigators. But even within that period, there was structure. The incidents had accelerated and then diminished, following a curve that looked almost organic, as if something had moved through different phases. The descriptions varied from report to report, but there were consistent elements: large wings, impossible size, a sense of intelligence and malevolence. Some witnesses described a man-shaped form, others described something more alien. But the most common description, especially in the older accounts I found, was Mothman. It appeared that locals had given the creature a name, whether out of fear, familiarity, or some attempt to control the inexplicable through language. I spent one entire evening in the Historical Society's basement archive, surrounded by filing cabinets and humidity and the smell of aging paper. The archivist, a woman named Sarah who must have been in her 70s, had asked what I was researching. I'd given her a vague answer about understanding the region's environmental history. She hadn't believed me, but she'd let me work undisturbed. One journal entry written in faded ink in a handwriting that suggested arthritis or age caught my attention. The entry was dated November 1966, and it was written by someone named James Kershaw, identified in a note as a retired game warden. In sparse, practical language, he documented a sighting he'd made while patrolling near the TNT area. His description was remarkably similar to what I'd seen. The enormous wings, the peculiar quality of the movement, the sense of being observed by something intelligent. But what struck me most was his conclusion. Kershaw had written, in words that were simultaneously mundane and haunting, "It knows the place. It comes when conditions align. It watches to see if we understand. If we understand, it leaves us be. If we don't, it waits." The entry ended abruptly, and there were no further entries from Kershaw in the files. I made a note of his name and resolved to attempt to locate him, though I suspected from the age of the handwriting that he might no longer be living. By the third week of December, I'd made a decision that would have seemed madness to my earlier self. I was going to attempt another encounter with the creature, but this time I would be prepared. I would go back to the TNT area, back to the place where I'd first seen it, and I would try to understand what it was and why it had chosen this location. The night I selected was December 21st, the winter solstice. It was a choice based on nothing more than intuition, a feeling that the creature's presence might be tied to astronomical or seasonal cycles. I'd taken a personal day, something I rarely did, and I spent the early part of the evening gathering materials. I brought my camera and documentation equipment, but I also brought other things. Printed maps of the area, notations about the old sighting locations, a journal for real-time observations, and, somewhat absurdly, a digital audio recorder. If I couldn't explain what I was experiencing in words written afterward, perhaps capturing it as it happened might provide some clarity. I arrived at the TNT area just after sunset, at that liminal hour when twilight lingers but darkness is approaching inevitably. The temperature had dropped into the high 30s, and frost was beginning to form on exposed surfaces. I parked in the same location as before and gathered my equipment. This time, instead of randomly patrolling, I headed directly toward the clearing where I'd seen the creature. The path through the forest was more manageable than in other seasons, and I navigated it with growing confidence despite the poor light. The bunkers loomed around me, their concrete surfaces just barely visible in the dimness, like the partial remains of some ancient civilization. The clearing was empty when I arrived. The bunker where the creature had been perched showed no sign of recent activity. I set up my base camp, a slightly ridiculous term for an area where I spread out my materials and activated my audio recorder, and waited. The problem with patience is that it gives your mind time to work against you. Standing alone in the darkness of an abandoned military installation, waiting for something inexplicable to appear, provided an excellent environment for doubt and fear to flourish. I found myself questioning my judgment, wondering if what I'd witnessed before had been a genuine encounter or some elaborate combination of misidentification, fatigue, and the peculiar psychology of isolated, unfamiliar environments. An hour passed. Then two. The temperature continued to drop and I began to feel the cold working its way through my jacket. I was considering abandoning the vigil when I noticed something change in the quality of the darkness. It wasn't anything visual exactly, more a sense that the air itself had become charged with presence. Then I heard it, a sound like wind passing through something vast and fabric-like. My head snapped up, and I saw movement against the star-filled sky. The creature was diving at me, wings folded, descending from somewhere above the canopy. For a moment, pure panic flooded through me. The thing was coming directly at me and I had nowhere to go. No way to defend myself against something of that size and apparent malevolence. I activated my audio recorder fully, my hands shaking so badly I could barely manage the action, and I forced myself to stand still rather than run. The creature pulled up at the last possible moment, its wings unfolding in that same wrong, deliberate motion, creating a sound that was somehow louder and more present when I was near than it had been from a distance. It circled me once, its wings creating eddies in the air that I could actually feel against my body. Then it landed, perching on one of the concrete bunker structures that ringed the clearing. From this vantage point, it was closer than before, perhaps only 20 feet away. I could see details now that the darkness and distance had obscured. The creature's form was fundamentally humanoid, which was perhaps the most disturbing thing about it. It had a torso, arms, a head, but the proportions were all subtly wrong. The arms were too long, the joints bending in ways that human joints didn't bend. The head was large and roughly triangular, with features that were only barely recognizable as a face, if you forced yourself to see it that way. The eyes were what I'd remembered, large and reflective, but now I could see there was something almost pleading in them, or perhaps that was just what I wanted to see. The wings, folded now and held partially extended, were the creature's most striking feature. They weren't feathered, as I'd initially thought. The surface had a texture more like bat wings or the wings of some enormous insect. The membrane was translucent in places, revealing a network of what might have been veins or reinforcing structures. Along the leading edge, there were what appeared to be serrated teeth or projections, like the edge of a saw. I was recording all of this, my voice steadier than I would have expected as I documented every detail I could observe. The creature watched me, its large eyes tracking my movements, its enormous head tilting slightly as if it too was trying to understand what it was encountering. "Can you understand me?" I said aloud, feeling foolish and desperate simultaneously. "Are you trying to communicate?" The creature made a sound, a low, thrumming frequency that I felt more than heard, a vibration that seemed to come from the creature's chest cavity and radiate outward in waves. It was deeply unsettling, a sound that had no natural equivalent in my experience. It was almost musical, but discordant, notes that didn't quite harmonize playing in an order that suggested pattern but not meaning. Then, with a movement that was faster than anything I'd yet seen it do, the creature reached out with one of its elongated arms and pointed directly at me. The gesture was undeniably deliberate, undeniably purposeful. It was communicating something: intent, recognition, warning. I couldn't determine which, but the message was unmistakable in its clarity of purpose. I stumbled backward, my professional detachment finally cracking under the weight of proximity to something that was absolutely, irrefutably real and utterly beyond my comprehension. My foot caught on a root or exposed rock, and I fell hard, the air knocked from my lungs. When I looked up, the creature was gone. There was no sound of movement, no indication of flight or departure. It had simply ceased to be present. I lay on my back in the frost-cold clearing, my ribs aching, my breath coming in gasps, and I wondered if I was losing my mind, whether this was some kind of stress-induced psychosis, a manifestation of obsession taking on the appearance of physical reality. But my audio recorder was in my hand, still recording, and it had captured everything. When I played it back later, in the safety of my living room with all the lights on and several drinks inside me, I would hear my own voice describing details and observations. And then I would hear the creature's sound, that thrumming, discordant vibration, undeniably real, undeniably present in the recording. I gathered my equipment carefully, moving slowly to avoid aggravating my ribs or triggering any further response from the creature, which I could no longer sense anywhere in the clearing. The walk back to my truck felt longer than the walk in, or perhaps time was simply becoming unreliable in my perception, stretching and compressing according to my emotional state rather than any objective measure. It was only when I was driving away from the TNT area, back toward Point Pleasant, that I allowed myself to consider the full weight of what was happening. Whatever the creature was, it was real, it was intelligent, and it seemed to have taken an interest in me. That interest might be benign or neutral, or actively hostile, there was no way to know. But it was there, established, and unlikely to go away simply because I stopped looking for it. News travels fast in small towns. By the time I'd returned to my regular duties in early January, rumors had already begun to spread about unusual animal deaths on farms near Point Pleasant. These were different from the livestock disappearances I'd initially investigated. The animals, primarily cattle, were being found in scattered locations, sometimes miles from where they'd last been seen, and they all exhibited signs of trauma that didn't align with known predators or simple accident. I received an official request to investigate routed through the regional office. My supervisor, a practical man named Harrison who'd been with the service for 30 years, asked me to document the incidents and provide an assessment. He assumed predator activity, most likely an expanding black bear population or, less likely, a large feline, possibly a mountain lion dispersing from the Western Territories. These were explanations that fit within the established understanding of wildlife behavior. I investigated diligently and filed reports that suggested black bear activity while privately knowing the explanations were inadequate. The wounds on the animals showed signs of trauma that no known predator in West Virginia could create. The arrangement of the bodies seemed intentional rather than random, and in 3 separate instances, witnesses reported seeing something large and winged circling in the vicinity of the kill sites just before the animals were discovered. What I was beginning to understand was that the creature, this Mothman that locals had named, was not simply a mysterious animal occupying a specific habitat. It was actively engaging with the human community, leaving markers, escalating its visibility. It was performing a kind of communication, as James Kershaw's decades-old journal had suggested. On January 17th, I made contact with a local resident named Eleanor Vance. She was 73 years old, lived alone on a property that bordered the TNT area, and had been collecting reports of unusual activity in the region for nearly 50 years. Eleanor was not a casual hobbyist or a sensationalist. Her documentation was meticulous, her observations grounded in careful observation and a skeptical eye. She'd heard about my interest in the old sightings, word travels, and she'd invited me to examine her files. Her home was a small, neat house surrounded by overgrown gardens and bird feeders. The interior was equally organized, walls covered with maps and photographs, filing cabinets labeled by date and incident type. Eleanor made tea while I examined her collection, and she spoke with the calm certainty of someone who had made peace with knowledge that would sound inexplicable to others. "It's here," she said simply, handing me a cup of steaming chamomile. "It's been here for longer than either of us has been alive. But it comes in cycles. Right now we're entering a period of high activity. The encounters will escalate. The incidents will become more pronounced. And then, after a period of a few years, it will withdraw again and the forest will become quiet." "Why does it do that?" I asked, feeling the question was somehow inadequate even as I spoke it. Eleanor considered before answering. "I think it has to do with perception, with whether we're paying attention. The creature, I think it might be some kind of collector or observer. It learns something from watching us, from interacting with us. When conditions are right, when enough of us have seen it or been affected by it, I don't know, moves on, shifts locations, goes somewhere else to observe, to gather whatever it needs to gather." "That doesn't make any sense," I said, though even as the words left my mouth I knew they weren't true. It made a kind of sense. It had a pattern logic to it, even if the mechanics were completely alien. Eleanor smiled sadly. "Most of the things that truly matter don't make sense until you've lived with them long enough. I've been living with this for half a century. You're just beginning. But you've been marked now. It has chosen you for some reason. That's not something that happens randomly." Over the next several hours, Eleanor walked me through her files, reports dating back to the 1950s, though she believed the phenomena stretched back much further, into the indigenous history of the region, into the time before the military installation had been built. There were photographs, most unclear, most showing little more than dark shapes against backgrounds of forest and sky, but consistent in their depiction of something large and winged. There were witness interviews that Eleanor had conducted, transcripts of conversations with people who'd had direct encounters. Their accounts varied in details but aligned on essential elements: the size of the creature, its intelligence, the sense of being studied or judged by it. Several of the witnesses had reported feeling compelled to return to locations where they'd encountered the creature, as if something about the experience created a psychological hook that pulled at them. Eleanor also showed me records of deaths and disappearances. These were scattered through the decades, cases that official reports attributed to accidents, natural causes, or voluntary disappearances. But when Eleanor arranged them chronologically and overlaid them with her creature sighting records, a pattern emerged. Disappearances seemed to cluster during periods of high creature activity. Not all of them, certainly, but enough to suggest a correlation, however tenuous. "I believe," Eleanor said carefully, "that the creature sometimes takes people. Not frequently, not indiscriminately, but occasionally, when the circumstances align in some way I don't fully understand, someone encounters it, and they don't come back, or they come back changed, fundamentally altered." "That's impossible," I said, but my conviction was wavering. So is a creature with wings that large actually flying. So is an animal that can evade every standard method of tracking and documentation. So is the entire phenomenon we're discussing. But here we are, having a conversation about the impossible because we've both experienced it directly. Eleanor allowed me to copy some of her files, not all of them. She was protective of her archive, and I left her house with a deeper understanding of the phenomenon I'd begun to investigate. More importantly, I left with confirmation that I wasn't losing my mind. Eleanor was a rational, intelligent person who'd devoted decades to understanding something that defied explanation. If someone of her caliber believed in the creature's existence and its intentional patterns of behavior, then perhaps my own observations and experiences could be trusted. That night, I returned to the TNT area. I'd been drawn back repeatedly since my encounters, always with the stated purpose of documentation and investigation, but increasingly with the understanding that I was seeking direct contact with the creature. It was becoming a compulsion, and I was beginning to accept that the compulsion might be something the creature itself had initiated. The January night was clear and cold, stars sharp and abundant overhead. I moved through the forest paths with something approaching comfort now, the geography becoming familiar to my feet if not my mind. I'd brought my audio recorder again, along with a flashlight that I kept off, preferring to navigate by starlight and the minimal ambient light that filtered through the canopy. It was in a small ravine east of the main clearing that I encountered it again. The creature was perched on the exposed root system of a fallen tree, its wings folded against its body, its enormous head level with my own. This was the closest we'd been, and I could see details of its form that proximity allowed. The creature's face, if it could be called that, was almost humanoid in the arrangement of its features. There were eyes, 2 of them, positioned as eyes should be positioned, and something that might have been a mouth and nose, though the proportions were completely wrong. The skin, or hide, appeared to be a dark gray or black, with a slight iridescence that became apparent when light caught it at particular angles. There were what might have been ears, or sensory organs, extending from the sides of its head, long and pointed. "Why are you here?" I asked aloud, the words feeling absurd in the cold forest silence. "What do you want?" The creature made that same thrumming sound, but there was a variation in it this time, notes ascending and descending in a pattern that felt almost communicative. It reached out with one of its long-fingered hands, and I could see now that it had fingers, 5 of them, though they were elongated and double-jointed, and it touched the side of my face. The contact was cool, the texture of its skin like leather or treated hide. I felt a sense of something, a mental pressure or presence that was not quite telepathy but was definitely some form of communication. Impressions flooded my mind, images of the forest from an aerial perspective, a sense of vast distances and long spans of time, emotions that weren't quite emotions, states that didn't have human names or equivalents. Fear, wonder, hunger, patience, and something that might have been curiosity, all blended together in a way that my mind couldn't quite parse. Then, as quickly as the contact had begun, it ended. The creature withdrew its hand, stood up on the twisted root system, and spread its wings. They unfurled like enormous sails, and I could see that they were translucent in places, revealing what appeared to be muscle or sinew beneath the membrane. The serrated edges caught what little light there was, glinting faintly. The creature looked at me, really looked at me with those enormous golden eyes, and I understood with absolute certainty that it was making a decision, a choice, about me, about what happened next, about what role I would play in whatever was coming. Then it launched itself into the air, wings beating in that slow, deliberate rhythm that still seemed to defy the physics of flight. It climbed higher and higher, circling the ravine once, twice, 3 times. On its 4th pass, it flew directly over me, so close that I could feel the air displacement from its wings, could smell something strange and metallic in its wake. And then it was gone, climbing into the winter sky, its silhouette disappearing against the darkness overhead. I stood alone in the ravine, my face still tingling from where it had touched me, my mind spinning with impressions that wouldn't quite resolve into coherent thought. In the weeks that followed my encounter with the creature in the ravine, I experienced a subtle transformation that I struggled to articulate even to myself. The boundaries of my perception seemed to shift. I would find myself noticing things in the forest that I'd walked past hundreds of times without seeing, small markers, arrangements of objects, signs that felt intentional. A ring of stones in a clearing, branches bent and twisted into deliberate patterns, trails worn by repeated passage that didn't match any known animal's movement pattern. I began documenting these signs with the same methodical care I applied to standard wildlife reports. I created detailed maps showing the locations of each discovery, looking for patterns or clusters. What emerged was a geography of presence, a landscape marked and mediated by the creature's movement and attention. The TNT area was a hub, but the markers extended far beyond it, spreading into the surrounding forests in ways that suggested the creature's range was vast and its awareness of the landscape was complete. Eleanor, when I shared my findings with her in early February, was unsurprised. She'd documented similar markers in her own investigations, had drawn her own maps, had seen the same geography reveal itself. What she told me next, however, was something I'd been both dreading and expecting. "It's preparing to make a choice," she said. "I've seen this pattern before. Usually it happens before a disappearance. Someone becomes marked, like you have been. They begin to see the signs, to understand the language the creature is using. And then they either accept what's being offered, or they reject it. The acceptance usually leads to the person leaving the area, sometimes leaving their entire life behind. The rejection, she trailed off, but the implication was clear. "What are you suggesting?" I asked. Though I already knew the answer. "I'm suggesting that you need to decide what you want to do. You can stop investigating, you can request a transfer to another region, put distance between yourself and the creature's attention. That's the safest course. Or you can allow what's happening to proceed to whatever conclusion is approaching. But you can't remain in this suspended state indefinitely. The creature doesn't allow that." I spent the next week in a state of genuine existential turmoil. I examined my life, my career, my relationships, which admittedly were few and increasingly distant as my obsession had grown, my future plans. Everything felt suddenly contingent, dependent on choices I hadn't consciously made but was now being forced to acknowledge. And then, on February 14th, something happened that crystallized everything. A child, a girl named Kaylee, 8 years old, went missing from a residential area on the outskirts of Point Pleasant. The case was handled by local law enforcement, but because the area fell partially within territories I patrolled, I was asked to assist in the search efforts. We searched for 3 days. Search and rescue teams, volunteers, tracking dogs, systematic grid patterns covering the forest and surrounding areas. Nothing. No sign of the child, no indication of foul play, no evidence pointing toward any explanation. The girl had simply vanished while playing in her yard, between one moment and the next. I was part of one of the search teams, moving through the forest with practiced efficiency, when I found something. It was in a location that the official search efforts hadn't covered yet, a ravine several miles from where the child had disappeared. And what I found was the child herself. She was alive. That was the first miracle. She was standing in a clearing, looking confused and slightly disoriented, but physically unharmed. When she saw me, she ran to me with the kind of desperation that a lost child projects, and I gathered her up, my hands shaking as I called in her location to the search coordination team. But what I knew, and what no one else would ever know, was that the creature had returned her. She'd been in its presence for 3 days, and while she had no memory of where she'd been or what had happened during that time, she was fundamentally intact. When the medical examinations came back, there would be no evidence of trauma or abuse. It would be treated as a case of a child becoming lost and somehow finding her way back to a location that search parties could locate. That night, after Kaylee had been returned to her parents and the official case had been closed, I returned to the forest. I went to the clearing in the ravine where the creature had first touched my face, and I waited. It came as the moon rose, silent wings carrying it down from the darkness above the canopy. This time there was no circling, no elaborate approach. The creature landed directly before me and simply stood there, its enormous form silhouetted against the starlight. "You're saying that if I choose, you'll stop," I said aloud. "If I leave, if I stop investigating, if I put distance between us, you'll return to being a hidden thing, something that people report but never truly prove. You'll fade back into being a legend, a campfire story, a piece of regional folklore." The creature made no sound, but I felt that pressure in my mind again. Not quite telepathy, but something in that direction. Impressions, concepts, the sense of affirmation without words. And if I choose to stay, if I continue investigating, if I try to understand what you are and what you want, what happens then? The impressions shifted. Images of vast distances, of motion through darkness and starlight, of being in multiple places at once. Images of forests I'd never seen, of a landscape that was both earthly and utterly alien. Images of completion, of purpose fulfilled. The creature was offering me something, a kind of transcendence through understanding. Knowledge that would reshape how I perceived reality. Knowledge that came with a cost. "Why me?" I asked. "Of all the people you've encountered, why have you chosen to mark me specifically?" The creature reached out with one of its long-fingered hands and placed it against my chest, directly over my heart. I felt that same cool, leathery contact. And the impressions came again, more intense this time. I saw images of myself, standing in this forest at different ages, younger, older, moving through seasons and years. But in all the images, there was the creature, present or implied. The creature as a constant. The creature as a marker of something essential in my life that had already been determined long before this moment. "It was always going to be me," I whispered. "You've been tracking me for years, haven't you? This didn't start with the call about the sightings. This started much earlier. The creature withdrew its hand, and I understood from its stillness, from the angle of its enormous head, that I'd perceived something true. I'd understood something essential about the mechanics of what was occurring. I made my choice then. Not rationally, not through any process of logical decision-making, but through a kind of acceptance that I'd been moving toward since my first encounter in the clearing near the bunkers. The creature had marked me. The choice was not really mine to make. I could only choose how to engage with what had already been decided. I'll stay, I said. I'll continue investigating. I'll try to understand. And I'll document what I learn, as carefully and thoroughly as I'm able. Not to prove anything to anyone else, but to understand it myself. To bear witness to what you are, even if I never fully comprehend it. The creature made no response to this. Instead, it spread its wings one final time, vast and terrible and beautiful in the darkness. It flew upward, climbing toward the canopy, and as it passed through the branches above me, I could swear I heard it vocalize, that thrumming, discordant sound, but changed now, almost like affirmation, like acknowledgement. Then it was gone, and I was alone in the clearing with only the stars and the certainty that everything about my life had fundamentally altered. I filed for a transfer the following month, but not to escape the region. Instead, I requested a reassignment to the ranger station closest to the TNT area. My request was approved, partly because the position had been vacant, partly because I'd established myself as competent and reliable despite my oddities. My supervisor noticed something had changed in me. I was calmer, more focused, less erratic. He attributed it to accepting the position rather than fighting it. He was not entirely wrong. I continued my investigation of the creature's patterns, building on Eleanor's archive, refining my own documentation. Over the following years, I would have 3 more direct encounters with the Mothman of Point Pleasant. Each interaction would deepen my understanding, though complete comprehension would always remain just beyond reach. Eleanor passed away in the winter of 2018. I inherited her files and archives, all of her decades of careful documentation. I continued the work, preserving the knowledge she'd gathered, adding my own observations and insights. Sometimes, on clear nights when the forest feels most alive with possibility, I return to the old clearings where the creature and I have met. Usually I'm alone, but occasionally I feel the presence of something vast and watchful in the darkness, and I know that the contract between us remains in force. What I learned through all of this is that the world contains far more than we're equipped to understand through the lens of conventional knowledge. There are things in the wilderness that defy categorization, things that are neither fully animal nor fully intelligent in ways we recognize. Things that operate according to rules and purposes that exist outside our frameworks of comprehension. The creature is still here, in the forest surrounding Point Pleasant. It never left. It simply fades and intensifies according to cycles I can observe but not fully explain. And I remain here as well, documenting its presence, preserving the knowledge of what moves through the darkness when we're not watching, bearing witness to the impossible. My name is Marcus Colton. I'm a park ranger. And this is what I've devoted my life to understanding. Whether anyone believes this account is irrelevant, the truth exists independent of belief, and the creature, the vast and terrible and beautiful thing that flies through the night skies above West Virginia, continues its eternal work of observation and presence. In many ways, I'm simply a small piece of something far larger than myself, a footnote in a story that began long before I was born and will continue long after I'm gone. But I'll keep watching. And I'll keep documenting, because bearing witness is, in the end, the only thing we can truly offer to the inexplicable. Some assignments come with a quiet dread that settles in your stomach before you even understand why. This one arrived on a Tuesday morning when I was restocking the ranger station at Grafton, West Virginia. A small parcel of state forest that most tourists pass right through without thinking. The email said it was routine. A routine survey, routine equipment check, routine maintenance walk of the Northern Trail system. The word routine appeared 4 times in 3 paragraphs, which in my experience meant exactly the opposite. My name is Marco. I've been a ranger here for 6 years, long enough to know the forest's moods, long enough to recognize when something was off about the season or the animals or the angle of the light through the hemlock canopy. I'd started this job because I wanted solitude. I got it, mostly. The forest gives you that gift, but it takes something in exchange: awareness, a kind of hyper-vigilance that doesn't shut off even when you're home in town, buying groceries, sitting in a diner. You see the shadows in the grocery store the same way you see them in the woods. You listen to the ambient noise of your own house and find patterns in it that aren't really there. The assignment wasn't anomalous because of what it asked. It was anomalous because of who brought it. Remy showed up that morning in a state vehicle I'd never seen before. A black SUV with tinted windows and a state seal so new it still had the gloss on it. She wore khaki, like a ranger, but her boots were too clean, her jacket too perfectly fitted, and there was a badge clipped to her belt that wasn't the standard ranger issue. The position title below the photograph said Wildlife Assessment Specialist. "You're Marco," she said, not really a question. "That's right. I'm Remy Chen. I need to walk the North Ridge Trail and make some observations." She pulled out a laminated map, the kind you get from a print shop, not the Forest Service. It showed the ridge marked in red highlighter, but there were also some other notations. Circles, question marks, a series of dates scrawled in the margin. What kind of observations? The kind you file a report on and don't ask too many questions about. Remy folded the map back up, but not before I saw the dates clustered around the previous 3 autumns. October, November, scattered into early December. "When can you be ready?" "Ready for what?" "To guide me." The Forest Service request specifically asked for someone who knew the area well. "Your record is clean. You've never reported any unusual activity, which means either you're thorough and boring, or you know how to keep your mouth shut." I didn't like the insinuation, and I didn't like the way she was looking past me out the window toward the forest as if it held something personal to her. But I needed this job more than I needed my pride. "I'll get my pack," I said. "What are we looking for?" Remy's expression didn't change. Evidence of movement, possible denning sites, territorial markers. She paused, and something flickered across her face, not uncertainty exactly, but a kind of bracing, as if she was preparing herself for something. "We're looking for a large predator, something that doesn't match any of the animals we officially track in this region. There aren't any large predators in Grafton. No bears, no cougars. The biggest thing out there is a black bear from time to time, and they don't range in this area. Then we shouldn't find anything, and we can file a negative report." She turned away from the window. "Get your pack, Marco. We leave in 20 minutes. I should have said no. I should have called the district office and asked if this was legitimate. I should have listened to the part of me that understood, in that reptile brain way, that there was something wrong about all of this. The urgency, the secrecy, the way Remy kept glancing at her watch as if we were already late for something that mattered. Instead, I went to get my pack. The North Ridge Trail winds through the oldest part of the forest, where the trees are thick enough that even at noon the light comes through in cathedral shafts. There's a creek that runs parallel to the trail for about 2 miles, and the forest there is dense with rhododendron and mountain laurel. In autumn, it's beautiful in a way that makes your chest hurt. In autumn, it's also the kind of place where sound moves strangely, where you can hear something calling from far away and then suddenly, without any sense of movement, it sounds like it's right next to you. "Tell me about the animal sightings," Remy said as we started up the trail. She had a digital recorder clipped to her vest, and she was scanning the forest floor with a practiced eye. "No matter how small, no matter if you think it's irrelevant. There was a report from a hiker about 3 weeks ago. Said they saw something large moving through the brush about 50 yards off the trail. They described it as wolf-like in their written account, but when I talked to them on the phone, they admitted they didn't see it clearly. Could have been a large dog. Feral maybe, from one of the towns nearby." "Could have been," Remy repeated, not sounding convinced. "What else?" "Nothing official. But the hunters in town mention hearing something in the deep forest. Something that doesn't sound like any animal they know. They say it's gotten worse in the last few weeks, more frequent." We walked in silence for a while, and I found myself paying attention to the quality of that silence. The forest was too quiet. No bird calls beyond the standard early autumn tape loop of crows and jays, no squirrels crashing through the canopy. Just the sound of our footsteps and our breathing, and the creek off to our left, running over stones in its endless, patient way. "Are you afraid?" Remy asked suddenly. "Of what?" "Of what lives here, in the deep places." She stopped at a place where the trail widened slightly, near a stand of ancient hemlocks. Their trunks were wider than a man was tall, their bark twisted into patterns that looked almost intentional, almost like writing. "People develop instincts about danger. You've been in this forest for 6 years. You've spent nights alone out here. You've learned to read the signs. What does your instinct tell you?" I wanted to say I wasn't afraid. I wanted to tell her that the forest was beautiful and wild and fundamentally indifferent to human life, and that was all there was to fear. I wanted to keep my job. "Something's been using this trail," I said instead. "Not following it, not exactly, running parallel to it, hunting in a pattern. I've found scat, but I don't know what it came from. There's scat from the typical predators, coyotes mostly, but there's something else, larger. The droppings are consistent with something carnivorous and large." "Have you collected samples?" "No. I didn't want to draw attention to it. Didn't want the district office sending out teams and closing the trail." Remy nodded as if this was exactly what she expected me to say. "Good. Show me where." We found the site about a mile further up the trail, where the forest opened up slightly into a small clearing created by a fallen hemlock. The tree had crashed down years ago, and the space it left was colonized by saplings and scrub oak, creating a kind of natural tangle that animals used as a pathway. The scat was there, 3 separate deposits, each one the size of a man's fist. Remy knelt down and examined them without touching them, her face close to the ground, and I felt something turn over in my stomach watching her. This was someone who had done this many times before. Someone who knew exactly what she was looking at. "Canine," she said finally, "but not dog, not coyote." She pulled out her phone and took several photographs, close up and from different angles. The bone fragments are too large. The structure of the feces indicates a very different diet than any native canine. And the age, this one is 2 days old, maybe 3. "What is it then?" Remy stood up and turned to look back toward the trail we'd come from. The forest seemed to close in tighter from here, the trees leaning toward us, the shadows deepening between the trunks. "That's what I'm here to find out. There's been a population in the eastern forests for years. It was initially documented in Grafton, hence the name, but it's spread. West Virginia, Pennsylvania, parts of Ohio. Reported sightings that go back further than anyone wants to admit officially, but the sightings are increasing, the range is expanding, and we don't have any idea why." "The name," I said. "Grafton what?" Remy didn't answer immediately. She was looking at something in the distance, beyond the clearing, into the deeper forest where the light barely reached. "Grafton monster. That's what the locals call it. That's what all the old reports call it. What the hunters whisper about around bonfires when they think no one's listening. But that's just a legend, a cryptid." "Is it?" Remy turned back to me, and there was something like pity in her eyes. "Or is it just something we don't have a classification for yet? Something our system doesn't have a box for, so it exists in the space between official reality and folk legend? Come on, we need to get higher up the ridge before it gets dark." We climbed for another hour, and the trail became progressively less maintained. The forest here was primordial in a way that made my chest feel tight. The trees had names: hemlock, red oak, birch, but they felt like they existed in some private living language that humans had never really learned. The canopy was so thick now that it might have been dusk at 3 in the afternoon. Our footsteps on the leaf litter sounded very loud, and I kept expecting something to move in the spaces between the trunks. "Do you hear that?" Remy whispered. I listened. At first I heard nothing, and then I heard it. A sound like wind through distant trees, but persistent, and underneath it something else, a kind of thrumming, almost ultrasonic, at the very edge of perception. It made my teeth ache. "Vocalization," Remy said. "They've been documented vocalizing across a range that includes both audible and ultrasonic frequencies. The sound carries farther than you'd expect, farther than it should." "What does it mean?" "Nothing good. Probably territorial. Possibly a call to others. Possibly hunting communication." Remy pulled out a device that looked like a modified directional microphone and pointed it deeper into the forest. "Come on, we need to move back down the ridge. Now." We didn't get far. The attack came without warning, which was the most terrible thing about it. Not the violence itself, but the absolute shock of it. One moment we were walking down the trail, and the next moment the world exploded. There was a sound like nothing I've ever heard, a howl or a roar or something that my brain couldn't properly categorize. It came from the right side of the trail, from the thick brush beneath the hemlock canopy, and it came with such force that I staggered backward. Remy had her hand on a device clipped to her belt, not a weapon, something else, something that made a high-pitched chirping sound. The creature, whatever it was, fell silent for just a moment, enough for us to run. We ran downhill through the forest, crashing through dead fallen brush, my pack bouncing against my shoulders, my lungs burning. Behind us, I could hear it moving, fast, so terrifyingly fast, with a sound like wind and thunder combined. It made no effort to follow the trail. It simply came through the forest as if the trees weren't there, and I realized with a spike of pure animal panic that it moved through this place the way I moved through air. This was its domain, and we were the intruders. Remy was ahead of me, and she was moving with purpose, angling downslope toward the sound of the creek. The water was loud here, rushing over rocks, and as we reached the banks I understood her plan. We jumped, falling about 15 feet into the rocky creek bed. The water was cold enough to stop my breath, and the current was stronger than I expected. We scrambled across to the other side, pulling ourselves up the far bank by grabbing roots and rocks, and then we were scrambling back up the slope opposite the trail. The creature stood at the top of the bank above us, silhouetted against the less dark of the forest. I could see its shape, massive, wrong, bipedal, but also somehow not quite that. Its outline suggested something between a bear and a man, but also neither of those things. It was too large, too angular in the wrong places. Its head was disproportionately small for its body, its shoulders too wide, too hunched. We stared at each other across the creek for a moment that felt like eternity. I could hear Remy's ragged breathing next to me, could feel the icy water dripping from my clothes. The creature made a sound then, not a roar, something quieter and more terrible. Something like a laugh or a grinding of stone. Then it vanished back into the forest, leaving only the sound of its passage, fading into the distance. We didn't talk until we made it back to the ranger station and the sun had completely fallen from the sky. Remy was soaked through and shivering, and I made coffee without asking, just set up the camp stove in the back office and put the kettle on. She sat at the desk, wringing out her hair, and I tried not to think about what I'd seen in that moment when the creature was visible against the fading light. "It doesn't attack unless it feels threatened," Remy said finally, wrapped in a blanket I'd dug up from the storage closet. "It was hunting us. It was curious. We came into its territory with a vocalization device, making sounds it probably recognized as a challenge or a threat. It responded. It let us go when the situation changed." Remy sipped the coffee I'd made. "That's actually useful information. We know its threat assessment protocol." "Why are you here?" I asked. "Really?" Remy looked at me over the rim of her cup. "Because there's a problem developing. The creature, or creatures, there may be more than one, have stopped avoiding human contact. They're becoming bolder. There have been 3 missing persons reports in the surrounding counties in the last 6 months, all of them in rural areas, all of them in the autumn months. No bodies, no evidence of struggle. The families reported hearing strange sounds before the persons disappeared." "You think it's killing people?" "I think it's possible. I think it's also possible that the creature is simply scavenging, and the missing persons are unrelated. But the pattern is concerning enough that someone has to investigate it. Unofficially, quietly, without causing panic." "Are you going to keep investigating?" "Yes. And I'd like you to help me. There's a fee, and it's not insignificant. The Forest Service has a quiet fund for exactly these kinds of situations. You'd be conducting a biological survey, which is technically true. You'd have authority to go places and ask questions that a civilian couldn't." I should have said no. The sane part of me, the part that wanted to keep living a normal life, wanted to say no. But I'd seen something in that moment in the forest, and it had changed the way I understood the world. There was something here that didn't fit into any category that science had a name for. And that something, in a weird way, made me feel less alone. "Okay," I said, "but we do this properly. We prepare, we bring better equipment, and if anyone asks, I'm filing a regular survey report with the district office." Remy nodded, and something that might have been relief crossed her face. "You're a good man, Marco. I have a feeling you're going to earn that fee." That was the beginning of it. That was the moment when the forest stopped being just my job and became something else entirely. The moment when I understood that there were things living in the deep places that no one had decided what to do about yet. Things that moved in the spaces between the official world and the hidden one. And I, for better or worse, had chosen to follow them into those spaces. The night was very dark. The creek outside the ranger station kept up its endless conversation with the stones, and the forest pressed against the building's walls with a kind of patient, predatory attention. Inside, Remy drank coffee and made notes, and I tried not to think about the sound that creature had made, the one that might have been a laugh or might have been something warning us away. I went outside to smoke, and I stood on the station's small porch looking out at the darkness. The stars were incredible that night, unshadowed by any light pollution. The constellations hung in their ancient patterns, indifferent and infinite. Somewhere in the forest, beyond the reach of the station's lights, something was moving. Something that belonged here in a way I never would, no matter how many years I worked these trails. I wondered what it was hunting tonight. I wondered if the missing persons had seen the stars like this before the forest took them. The cigarette burned between my fingers, and I didn't put it out until it singed the webbing between my thumb and forefinger. The pain was sharp and real and grounding. It reminded me that I was still human, still vulnerable, still afraid. The forest breathed around me, and I breathed back, and something in the darkness heard both of us and made a sound that wasn't quite laughter. The next morning came gray and cold, with mist hanging in the low places of the forest like something solid. Remy was up before dawn, equipment spread across the ranger station's table like a surgeon preparing instruments. I made more coffee and tried not to think about how close I'd come to becoming one of those missing persons the night before. "I'm going to need blood," Remy said, not looking up from the device she was calibrating. "From the creature if possible. Hair samples, tissue, anything that can be analyzed. That means getting close to it." "Yes, you're insane." "Possibly." She looked at me then, and I saw that she hadn't slept. Her eyes had that hollow, fever-bright quality of someone running on pure adrenaline and coffee. "But if we don't understand what this thing is, if we don't gather evidence, then it remains in the realm of folklore and campfire stories, which means we can't protect against it, can't predict its behavior, can't warn people. We're left in the dark and it continues to hunt. There are other rangers, other researchers, better equipment, better training, better cover stories, you mean?" "Yes, there are. But this situation is official enough to be interesting to me and unofficial enough to be deniable to the government. If something goes wrong, I'm a rogue researcher obsessed with cryptid mythology. You're just a ranger who encountered an unusual animal. We're not military, we're not official, which means if something happens to us, it didn't happen in any way that matters. That's the balance we're working with." I understood, but I didn't like it. How do we even get close to it? We use its pattern against it. Animals, all animals, establish territories and patrol them on regular schedules. We observed it in 2 locations yesterday. We know it hunts in the early evening and moves through the forest in predictable ways. If we can establish a baseline timeline, we can predict where it will be and when. And then what? We hide and wait for it to walk past us? We hide and we tranquilize it. I stared at her. "You have a tranquilizer that works on something that large?" "I have a tranquilizer that's calibrated for large primates and large predatory mammals. Whether it works on this creature is an open question, but we have to try something." Remy pulled out a case from her pack, the kind of thing you'd use to store expensive optics or jewelry. Inside, nestled in foam, was a large caliber tranquilizer rifle. "You know how to use one of these?" "I've trained with them, for bear management." "Good. You'll carry it. I'll carry the collection kit." She closed the case and looked out the window at the gray morning. "We need to move today while we have the daylight. The weather's holding, but that front moving in from the north could change that. If we get rain, the animal's scent marking gets washed away, and we lose our tracking advantage." We spent the morning preparing. I checked the tranquilizer rifle's sight, assembled the darts, familiarized myself with the weight and balance of it. It felt wrong in my hands, too purpose-built, too violent, but it was better than the alternative, which was nothing. Remy prepared the collection kit with the methodical precision of someone who had done this many times before. Plastic bags, forceps, sterile swabs, collection tubes, a portable cooler packed with ice. "Where did you learn to do this?" I asked. "The university mostly. Comparative biology, but also field work. I've tracked creatures in the Pacific Northwest, in New Mexico, even a few expeditions to Borneo." She was wrapping the cooler in thermal material, insulating it against the ambient temperature. "Most of what I studied was officially classified as extinct, endangered, or mythological. But extinction is a strange thing. Just because we stop seeing something doesn't mean it stops existing. It just means it got better at hiding." "Is that what the government knows? That there are animals out there we've decided don't exist?" "The government knows all kinds of things it has decided don't exist. It's easier that way. Easier to manage the public if you control what exists and what doesn't." Remy sealed the cooler. "But the things that don't officially exist still eat and breed and die like anything else. They still interact with the human world, and sometimes those interactions create problems that have to be solved quietly." "Is that what this is? A quiet solution?" "This is the data gathering phase. If we can prove that there is indeed an unknown large predator operating in this region, then the solution phase becomes someone else's problem. They'll bring in specialists, decide what to do. But if we don't gather the data, then it remains a mystery, and mysteries don't get solved. They just get worse. By noon, we were back on the North Ridge Trail, the tranquilizer rifle loaded and ready, Remy's collection kit packed light enough to carry comfortably. The forest seemed less threatening in daylight, but that might have been my imagination. The trees were still ancient, the shadows still deep, but the light made it feel navigable, survivable. According to my calculations, Remy said as we climbed, the creature should be active in the evening, probably moving toward the lower ridges where there's more game. If we position ourselves at the creek crossing we used yesterday, we should have a good vantage point. It has to cross the creek to move between the upper ridge and the lower hunting grounds, and if it doesn't, then we try again tomorrow. But it did. Just as the sun was starting its descent toward the ridgeline, we heard it moving through the forest. It was cautious this time, aware that something had disrupted its territory. It moved parallel to the creek rather than directly toward it, and I had to shift position to get a clear shot. Remy put her hand on my arm. Wait, let it get closer. The creature emerged from the brush about 40 meters downslope from us. In daylight, even the gray light of dusk, I could see it more clearly than I wanted to. It was roughly humanoid in shape, but all wrong in the proportions. The arms were long and thick, more suited to knuckle walking than upright locomotion, though it was moving upright. The face was hidden from me, turned away, but I could see the way its head sat on its shoulders, angular, almost bird-like, despite the massive size of its body. Its fur was dark, almost black, matted and thick. Now, Remy whispered. I aimed for the shoulder, a large muscle mass, and fired. The tranquilizer dart struck true, burying itself in the creature's back. For a moment nothing happened. Then the creature shrieked, a sound so loud and terrible that it seemed to shake the forest itself, and began running. It didn't run away from us. It ran directly toward the creek, toward us, and I had maybe 30 seconds to reload the rifle. I fumbled with the second dart, my hands shaking, and got it loaded just as the creature reached the creek's edge. It didn't jump across. It simply waded into the water as if the current wasn't a problem, as if gravity didn't apply to it in the same way it did to normal animals. Its eyes were visible to me now, bright and intelligent, and absolutely full of rage. It was looking directly at me, and I realized with a terrible certainty that it had decided I was the threat. I shot the second dart. This one hit the chest, and I saw the creature's movement falter slightly. The tranquilizer was working, but not fast enough. It was almost to the other side of the creek now, climbing the bank with effort, its movements becoming less coordinated. It got maybe 10 meters up the slope before its front legs gave out. It tried to crawl, dragging itself forward with its massive arms, and then it collapsed. We waited a good 5 minutes before moving. Remy was taking readings on some kind of device, checking the animal's vitals from a distance. Heart rate is elevated but stable. Temperature is high, probably baseline for this species. It's unconscious. Let's move. Getting close to it now felt like walking up to a sleeping tiger. Every fiber of my being was screaming at me to run, to flee, to abandon this insanity. But Remy was already moving, already kneeling beside the massive, breathing form of the creature. This close I could see the texture of its fur, coarse, thick, matted with mud and leaves. Its skin underneath had the quality of old leather, and there were scars visible on the exposed patches. It had fought, many times. It had survived things. Hair first, Remy said, cutting small sections of fur from the creature's shoulder and back. She placed them carefully in plastic bags, labeled them with a marker. Then blood. I'll need a good sample from a vein. Can you hold the tranquilizer rifle steady if I position the arm? I did what she asked, though it felt like the worst kind of violation. The creature's arm was massive, thicker than my leg, and hot. It was definitely bleeding now, a dark fluid that looked almost black in the failing light. Remy collected samples in vials, sealed them, placed them in the cooler with practiced efficiency. Okay, now I need tissue. A skin sample. She pulled out a small surgical knife and cut a piece of skin about the size of a thumbnail from the creature's upper arm. This is going to be good. This will give us genetic information, baseline physiology, disease markers if there are any. As she worked, I became aware of a sound. It was faint, underneath the normal ambient noise of the forest, but it was definitely there. A vocalization, distant, coming from deeper in the woods. Another creature, responding to the absence of this one. We need to hurry, I said. 1 more minute. I need a dental impression. Remy pulled out a small container of soft modeling paste. She inserted it into the creature's mouth, being careful of the teeth, which were large and absolutely terrifying, built for tearing meat. These are more complex than any canine or primate. This is something new. The sound from the forest was getting closer. Whatever was out there had heard the creature's scream, had recognized it as distress, and was coming to investigate. We need to go, now. Remy sealed the last vial and stuffed everything into the collection kit. We made it maybe 20 meters down the slope before the second creature emerged from the forest. This one was smaller than the first, perhaps a female or a younger individual, and it was moving with clear intent. It saw its companion sprawled unconscious on the forest floor and made a sound that was pure anguish, pure rage. Then it saw us. We ran. There was no heroic stand, no careful retreat. We simply ran, crashing down the slope toward the trail, the creature behind us moving faster than anything that size should have been able to move. It was gaining on us, and I could hear its breath coming in ragged, furious sounds. Remy was ahead of me, and she was running with the collection kit clutched to her chest. I was falling behind, my legs burning, my lungs screaming. The creature was right behind me now, close enough that I could hear the sound of its feet hitting the ground, the snapping of branches as it pushed through the forest. And then I was falling. There was a moment of weightlessness, a moment of understanding that I had run off the edge of a small ravine, and then I was crashing through vegetation and landing hard on my back in a bed of ferns. The impact drove the air from my lungs, and for a moment I couldn't breathe, couldn't think, could only lie there gasping. The creature appeared at the top of the ravine above me. It looked down at me with those intelligent, furious eyes, and it made a sound like nothing I'd ever heard, a sound that contained rage and grief and something that might have been recognition of the fact that I was, in that moment, absolutely helpless. Then Remy was pulling me up, was dragging me backward into the ravine's deeper shadow. She had her hand on some kind of device, and she was pointing it at the creature. The device made that high-pitched chirping sound again, the same sound that had worked the day before. The creature flinched but didn't back away. It climbed down into the ravine after us. "Run," Remy said. "Keep running, don't look back." We stumbled through the ravine using the rocks and vegetation to help us move, and the creature was still coming, still moving with that terrible purpose. But its movements were becoming less coordinated. The tranquilizer from the first encounter was probably still in its system, affecting its motor control. That bought us maybe another minute, enough to scramble out of the other side of the ravine and make it back to the trail. We didn't stop running until we could see the ranger station's lights through the trees. Even then, we didn't stop fully. We collapsed on the porch, both of us gasping for air, covered in dirt and blood and torn fabric. Remy was still clutching the collection kit, and despite everything, she was smiling. "We got samples," she said between gasps. "We actually got samples. There's another one I managed. A smaller one. They hunt in pairs, or maybe groups. I know this complicates things." Remy sat up, carefully opening the collection kit to verify that the samples were still intact. They were plastic and cold, carefully sealed, ready for analysis. Which means there's a population. Which means we're not dealing with a single anomalous creature, but an established breeding population. That's bad. That's very bad, Remy agreed. But it's also exactly the kind of evidence we need to make the next phase happen. Now we can prove it. Now we can force the government's hand. She pulled out her phone and took pictures of the collection kit, the samples carefully arranged. Then she started making calls. By the time I'd managed to stop shaking, she had spoken to someone named Dr. Ellison, someone in a regional office that I'd never heard of, and had secured authorization for a larger team to move in within the week. I sat on the porch in the cold night, smoking cigarettes and watching the forest. Out there, somewhere in the dark, the creature we'd tranquilized was probably waking up, and its companion was still awake, probably very angry, definitely aware that we had taken something from it. If not the creature itself, then some piece of it that might be used against it. I wondered what that meant for the missing persons. I wondered if the creatures had taken them for reasons we could understand, or for purposes we couldn't. I wondered what happened to people when they went into the deep forest and didn't come back. "You can leave," Remy said, appearing beside me with a fresh cup of coffee. "If you want. We have samples now. The next phase doesn't require your participation. Do you want me to leave?" "No. But I'd understand if you did." I took the coffee and drank it. It was bitter and hot, and it tasted like something I could hold on to. "I'm staying. Might as well see how this ends." Remy nodded, and something like respect crossed her face. It ends with answers, she said. Whatever happens, we get answers. That's the most important thing. But I wasn't sure that was true. Some questions, once you start asking them, don't lead to answers. They lead deeper into the dark, into places where the rules we'd made for the world stop applying. And in the darkness, there are always things waiting. Things that had been waiting long before we arrived, and would be waiting long after we were gone. Dr. Ellison arrived on a Thursday morning with a caravan of vehicles and a team of 5 specialists. I had expected something military, something official and authoritarian, but instead got something that felt almost academic. A group of quiet, intense people who moved with the efficiency of researchers who had done this many times before. Ellison herself was tall, thin, with gray threading through her dark hair and eyes that seemed to catalog everything they touched. She reviewed Remy's samples and the ranger station's facility in a single cursory tour, nodding as if she'd seen exactly what she expected. "The samples are degraded," she said, studying the vials under a portable lamp. "But there's still DNA. We'll get a preliminary analysis back in 3 days, maybe 4 if the lab is backed up. The tissue sample is excellent. The hair will be useful for trace elements and environmental exposure." "How long until we know what it is?" I asked. "Until we know what it is officially, you mean? Until we have a name for it." Ellison smiled, but it wasn't a comforting expression. 3 months, minimum. Maybe longer. These things always take longer than you expect. And until then, we observe, we gather more data. We establish the parameters of the population and the territory. She turned to Remy. "You've made 2 confirmed visual contacts and 1 physical contact. You say there are at least 2 individuals." "At least," Remy confirmed. "The secondary creature was smaller, possibly younger. There could be more we haven't detected." "All right. We'll establish a base camp up the ridge. Motion sensors, audio recorders, thermal imaging. We'll run the study for 10 days and see what we can establish about their movement patterns and social structure." Ellison turned to me. "You'll be the primary guide. You know the terrain. And if they become aggressive, we have protocols," one of the other team members said. He introduced himself as Hayes, and he had the bearing of someone with a military background. "We're equipped with non-lethal deterrence. The goal is observation, not confrontation." But observation meant placing ourselves in their territory, meant making ourselves visible and vulnerable in the one place where they had every advantage. It meant nights in the forest with nothing but motion sensors and the sounds of creatures we didn't understand. The base camp was established on a small plateau about halfway up the north ridge, positioned so that it had sight lines to 3 of the 4 directions. The team erected 3 tents and a larger canvas structure for equipment and supplies. They strung up motion sensors and placed audio recorders in a grid pattern extending about 50 meters in every direction. Thermal imaging cameras were mounted on tripods, all of them networked to a central monitoring station. "We're looking for patterns," Ellison explained as the team worked. "We want to know when they're active, where they concentrate, what triggers aggressive behavior. We want to know if they're territorial or migratory, if they hunt alone or in groups, if they have any communication patterns we can identify and predict." "What happens if they attack the camp?" I asked. "We have tranquilizers, we have air horns, we have flares, and we have the knowledge that they've consistently chosen not to engage when they could have." Ellison looked out at the forest. "They're intelligent, Marco. Not human intelligence, but close. They evaluate situations and make decisions based on threat assessment. If we don't present an overwhelming threat, they'll avoid us. And if we do, then we've made our first significant discovery about their behavior. Either way, we learn." The first night was quiet. Too quiet. The creatures knew we were here. They had to, but they didn't make contact. Instead, the forest seemed to hold its breath, to wait and watch. I sat in the equipment tent with Hayes, watching the thermal imaging screens, and tried not to think about what could happen if the creatures decided that the knowledge we represented was a threat worth eliminating. On the second night, we got our first clear thermal signature. It came from the east, moving down the ridge toward the camp. The image on the screen was ghostly but clear, a large heat mass moving with clear purpose. It stopped just outside our motion sensor perimeter and didn't move for nearly 20 minutes. "It's observing us," one of the other team members, a woman named Dr. Voss, said quietly. She was watching the footage with intense focus. "The body posture suggests investigation rather than aggression. It's trying to understand what we are." The creature left. It simply turned and walked back the way it had come, disappearing into the thermal static of the forest. but for those 20 minutes I felt like I was being studied by something that had developed its own theories about what humans meant, what danger they represented. On the third day, we found where they had bedded down. It was a cave about a mile northeast of the camp, partially hidden behind a screen of vegetation. Inside, the ground was matted with fur and bones, the remains of meals, mostly deer and wild boar, but also some larger animals whose bones I couldn't identify. "There are at least 4, Dr. Voss said, examining the evidence. "Possibly 5. Different sizes, different seasons of occupation. This is a den site, possibly a breeding den." "You mean they're nesting?" I asked. "I mean there could be young, juvenile specimens. That would explain some of the size variations we've detected thermally." Voss carefully collected samples, hair, bone fragments, scat, and placed them in labeled bags. "We need to establish whether we're dealing with a breeding population, and if so, how many generations are we looking at?" That night we heard them, not all at once, but in scattered calls from different parts of the forest. The vocalizations were complex, containing multiple frequencies, some audible and some ultrasonic. Dr. Voss had set up recording equipment specifically designed to capture a wide range of frequencies, and she was listening to the playback with something like awe. "This is language," she said. "Not instinct, not simple aggression. This is structured communication. They're calling to each other, sharing information. Listen, this one is responding to the first call, and the pattern is consistent with question and answer." "What are they saying?" I asked. "I don't know, but I'd like to figure it out." By the 5th day, the team had mapped out a clear territory. The creatures had a range that extended for several miles in every direction, with the cave serving as a central point. They moved between the cave and various hunting grounds, apparently following a regular schedule. 3 individuals, they determined, a large male, a slightly smaller female, and a juvenile of unclear sex. The juvenile was probably born the previous season, possibly the offspring of the adult pair. Ellison was becoming frustrated with the limitation of observation. "We need physical data," she said during a briefing on the 6th day. "We need to understand the genetic structure, the physiology, the anatomical systems. One tissue sample isn't enough." "You want to tranquilize them again," Remy said. "I want to establish protocols that allow us to document a living specimen." "Yes, tranquilization is part of that." "And what happens when they develop an association between our presence and physical trauma?" I asked. "What happens when they decide that we represent a threat worth acting on?" "Then we get to observe their threat response behavior, which is data we need." Ellison's expression was cold, clinical. "I understand your concern, Marco, but we're here to understand this species. That requires a level of interaction beyond passive observation." Hayes set up the operation for the next evening. He positioned tranquilizer teams at 3 separate vantage points, coordinating via radio. The idea was to immobilize the male, the most dominant individual, when it made its evening hunting run. Remy and I were positioned at the primary observation site, where we had a clear view of the trail the creature usually took. We waited for 3 hours, maintaining radio silence. The forest around us was alive with sound, normal sounds, the rustling of small animals, the calls of birds settling for the night. But underneath it all was the sense of being watched, of being evaluated. Then the creature appeared. It was different today, cautious. It moved slowly down the trail, its head up, clearly scenting the air, clearly aware that something had changed. It stopped directly below our position and made a sound, not a roar, not a growl, but something closer to a trumpet call. It was answered, from somewhere far deeper in the forest, with a similar call. "It's warning the others," Remy whispered. "It knows we're here, and it's telling the others to stay away." But the male didn't leave. Instead, it moved directly toward our position, toward the sound of Hayes preparing the tranquilizer. And when Hayes fired, the creature didn't flee. It charged. The tranquilizer dart struck the creature's shoulder, but the dart bounced off before it could fully embed. The skin was tougher than we'd expected, and the projectile simply fell away. The creature reached Hayes before any of us could process what was happening. It moved with speed that defied its size, and it made a sound that combined rage and something that might have been pain. Hayes went down, the tranquilizer rifle falling from his hands, and the creature made that terrible sound again. But the sound changed. It changed from rage to something almost like confusion, and the creature stumbled, its movements becoming uncoordinated. Ellison had fired the backup tranquilizer, had nailed it directly in the flank this time, and the dose was hitting harder than the creature had expected. The massive body went down, crashing through the vegetation with a force that shook the earth. For a moment, everything was still. Then Hayes was moving, was checking himself for injuries, and Ellison was moving toward the creature with medical equipment. "It's down," Hayes said into the radio. "Primary specimen is tranquilized. We need immediate data collection." We all moved to the site. The creature was enormous up close, easily 10 feet tall and weighing what must have been 800 pounds or more. Its breath was shallow but regular, and its eyes had closed. In unconsciousness, it looked less terrifying. Just a large animal, breathing, existing. "We need to work fast," Ellison said. "The tranquilizer will hold for maybe 30 minutes. I need blood work, tissue samples, bone density samples. Dr. Voss, get the genetics kit, get everything." They worked with intense focus, and I stood there watching, the tranquilizer rifle loaded and ready, trying to ignore the sound of the other creatures calling from deeper in the forest. That sound was getting closer. That sound was full of urgency and something that might have been desperate concern. "We're running out of time," I said. "The others are coming." 20 more minutes, Ellison said. "We need 20 more minutes." But we didn't have 20 minutes. The calls from the forest had become almost constant now, and then one of the motion sensors at the camp's perimeter triggered. Not one sensor but 3 activated in quick succession. Multiple thermal sources converging on the camp, came a voice from the camp over the radio. "2 large, 1 small. I'm not sure what they're doing, but they're not approaching, they're circling." "Pack everything up," Ellison ordered. "We're leaving now." We moved faster than I thought possible given the amount of equipment, but the creature on the ground was starting to come around, its breathing becoming more agitated, its eyes beginning to open. We were maybe 50 meters away when the other creatures came into view. They came from the forest like shadows gaining substance. The female, clearly, because she was smaller but no less terrifying. And the juvenile, which was still huge, still powerful, but carried itself with less confidence. The female saw her companion on the ground and made a sound that I can only describe as grief mixed with rage. "Run," Ellison said flatly. We ran. Behind us, the creatures didn't follow. They stayed with the unconscious male, protecting him, possibly trying to rouse him. We made it back to the camp and started packing the equipment with desperate urgency. The other creatures stayed at the edge of our perimeter, watching, making those terrible sounds. "We need to go," I said. "We need to leave the forest, now." Ellison looked at the samples they'd collected, at the data from the tranquilization, at everything they'd gathered, and something in her expression shifted. "All right," she said, "we're evacuating." It took 2 hours to pack everything and get down the ridge. The creatures followed us, not attacking, not engaging, just moving in parallel to our retreat. And when we reached the ranger station, they stopped at the edge of the forest and watched us secure the doors and turn on the lights. We didn't sleep that night. Hayes was shaken by the encounter, though he sustained no serious injuries. Dr. Voss was almost manic with excitement, cataloging the samples, preserving them for transport. And Ellison sat at the ranger station's table, staring at nothing, her expression unreadable. "What happens now?" I asked. "Now we process the data. We verify the samples. We write a report that's both truthful and limited in scope." Ellison looked at me. "People are going to want to kill these creatures. Once we acknowledge their existence, once we provide evidence, there will be calls to eliminate them as threats. Hunters will mobilize, the state will authorize culling, and by this time next year they'll be extinct. Or they'll kill someone first," I said. "Or they'll kill someone first," Ellison agreed. "Either way, we've set something in motion that can't be stopped." The team left the next morning. They loaded the equipment and the samples into their vehicles and drove away, leaving only the tracks in the mud to prove they'd ever been there. I was alone again in the ranger station, and the forest was very quiet. That night, I heard the creatures calling from the deep forest. They called for a long time, back and forth, their vocalizations complex and structured. I sat on the porch with a cup of coffee and listened, trying to understand if there was real language in those sounds or if I was just projecting meaning onto animal noises. By the next day, the official reporting had begun. Ellison's preliminary findings suggested a previously undocumented species possibly related to known great apes but with distinct characteristics that warranted further study. The photographs of the samples were carefully presented, the genetic markers highlighted, the skeletal features detailed. And in the margins of the report, almost as an afterthought, was a section on potential behavior patterns and threat assessment. The internet did the rest. By the end of the week, there were cryptid enthusiasts from across the country making their way to Grafton, hoping to catch a glimpse of the creature that had been photographed and documented. There were news crews, there were park rangers and wildlife officials, there were hunters preparing weapons and laying traps, and in the deep forest, the creatures went silent. Absolutely, completely silent. For 3 days we heard nothing. No calls, no vocalizations, no thermal signatures on the equipment the team had left behind. They had withdrawn deeper into the forest, or they had moved on, or they had decided that the creature known as mankind had proven itself to be a threat beyond their ability to manage. I never saw them again. The search teams found nothing. The hunters found nothing. The news crews eventually gave up and moved on to the next story. By winter, the forest had retreated into its natural silence, and the creatures were just legend again, cryptids, the kind of story you heard around bonfires that no one quite believed. But I knew they were still there. Somewhere in the deep places they moved through the forest, teaching their young to avoid humans, to recognize the danger that we represented. And they would survive, because they had learned the most important lesson, that humans feared what they didn't understand, and that this fear was the most reliable protection they could ask for. 6 months passed. Winter came and went, and with it came the isolation of the ranger station, the snow, the cold, the long nights where the only sounds were the wind and the occasional movement of animals in the dark. I continued my patrols, continued my reports, but something had fundamentally changed in how I understood the forest. Remy visited in February, arriving with samples and a new set of questions. The preliminary genetic analysis had come back, and it was complicated. The DNA sequence had enough similarity to primate DNA to be recognizable, but enough difference to be inexplicable. The creature's genome contained genetic markers that hadn't been seen in any living species, markers that suggested either a rapid evolutionary divergence from a known species or a completely separate evolutionary lineage that had remained hidden from human science. "They're not apes," Remy said, showing me the charts and graphs on her laptop. "They're not humans. They're something else entirely. Something that branched off from a common ancestor maybe 200,000 years ago, maybe longer. They've been evolving separately, developing their own adaptations, their own society." "Why?" I asked. "Why hide? Because we're dangerous. Because we kill things we don't understand. Because they learned, probably through hard experience, that the best survival strategy is invisibility." Remy closed the laptop. "There are reports coming in from other states now, similar sightings, similar descriptions, Kentucky, Pennsylvania, even Ohio. Whatever these creatures are, they have a wider range than we initially thought. Is there going to be an official classification? Are they going to acknowledge their existence? Not if the government has anything to say about it." The preliminary genetic analysis was leaked to a cryptid researcher forum, and now the internet is full of speculation. But there's no official statement, no official record, no acknowledgement by any agency. As far as the government is concerned, you tranquilized and photographed a large dog. People know better. People know what they think they know. The majority of people will ignore it, forget about it, move on. Some will believe, some will keep searching, but none of them will find anything because the creatures have learned their lesson. They've retreated back into the myth. That was the thing that haunted me the most. The creatures hadn't been killed. They hadn't been captured or studied or dissected. They had simply learned that the surface world was too dangerous, too unpredictable, and they had withdrawn back into the deep places where humans rarely went, and where science hadn't learned to look. But I still saw them sometimes, not clearly, not close enough to photograph or study, just glimpses, a shape moving between trees, a sound that didn't quite match any known animal. Once, in late March, I found fresh tracks on the North Ridge Trail, massive 5-toed prints, and I knew they were still there, still moving through their territory, still surviving. The missing persons issue never got resolved. The 3 people who had disappeared in the autumn months before the team's arrival were never found. Their families made appeals on local news stations, and search volunteers combed the forest with dogs and ATVs and GPS units. But the forest gave up nothing. Either the creatures had nothing to do with the disappearances, or they had been careful enough with their kills that there was nothing left to find. By spring, the forest had returned to something approaching normalcy. The tourists came back. The trail systems filled up on weekends with hikers and nature photographers. The creatures responded by being absolutely invisible. It was as if they had learned to phase out of human perception, to move through the spaces where humans weren't looking. I ran into Ellison one day in town, at a coffee shop in Grafton proper. She was reviewing papers, making notes, and she looked simultaneously exhausted and satisfied. "The final report is being prepared," she told me. "It will be quietly filed with several government agencies, and then it will be archived. It will be officially unavailable to the public, classified as preliminary research of uncertain value. Essentially, it will not exist. And the creatures? They'll continue to exist. Unmapped, unstudied, uncategorized, but they'll exist. And they'll have the one thing they needed most, official denial. As long as they don't exist in any official capacity, they're protected by the simple fact that no official agency is actively hunting them." "Is that protection or just postponement?" Ellison smiled. "For creatures like this, for creatures smart enough to adapt, postponement is all that matters. They buy time, and time buys survival." I never told anyone the full story of what happened that autumn. The official report said we'd documented an unusual large predator and collected biological samples for analysis. The biological analysis was inconclusive, or so I let it be known. There was no proof, no evidence, nothing that would stand up in a courtroom or in the court of scientific opinion. But I knew, and more importantly, the creatures knew. By summer, I was spending more time in the forest, not on official ranger business, but just walking, existing in the spaces where they moved. I never saw them directly, but I felt their presence. I felt watched, in the way that you feel watched when you're not alone in a room. And sometimes, at dusk or dawn, I heard their calls, distant, fading, like the echo of something that had decided, ultimately, that humans weren't worth the risk. One evening in August, I was sitting on the ridge overlooking the valley, watching the light change as the sun descended. The forest was beautiful that day. Gold light through the canopy, the smell of earth and growing things, the sound of wind in the branches. I heard the creature long before I saw it, heard its breath and the soft crunch of its footsteps on the forest floor. It came out of the trees about 50 meters away and looked directly at me. The female, I thought, based on the smaller size. She stood there for a long moment, and we regarded each other across the distance. I didn't reach for the tranquilizer rifle that was no longer part of my ranger equipment. I just sat there, quietly, proving that I was not a threat. The creature made a sound. Not loud, not aggressive, something almost like an acknowledgement. And then she turned and walked back into the forest, disappearing as if she had never been there at all. I never saw her again. But I knew she was there. I knew they were all there, still moving through the deep forest, still teaching their young the sounds of the forest, still hunting, still surviving. They had chosen to let me live, to let me continue my work, to let me guard their secret. And in exchange, I had chosen to keep it. The forest holds many secrets. Most of them will never be known, never be studied, never be filed in any official database. Some things are meant to remain mysteries, meant to exist in the space between what we know and what we've decided doesn't exist. The creatures of Grafton had found their place in that space, and there they would remain, real, intelligent, alive, and forever unknown to the world that might otherwise destroy them. I am still the ranger here. I still walk these trails, still file my reports, still maintain the official fiction that nothing unusual has ever happened in this forest. And the creatures still move through the deep places, still call to each other on quiet nights, still teach their young to fear and avoid the creatures called humans. The forest is their world, and they are its true guardians. I am only a witness, and I have learned to be content with that role. There are worse things than keeping secrets. There are worse things than knowing that magic, strange, terrible, beautiful magic, still exists in the wild places of the world, if only you have the courage to remain silent about it. The autumn is coming again, and with it the creatures will move closer to civilization, hunting before the season turns. The hunters will go out looking for them, armed with weapons and determination. They will find nothing, because the creatures have learned their lesson well. And I will sit in the ranger station and listen to the forest breathe. And I will remember what it felt like to stand face to face with something that shouldn't exist but does. And I will keep the silence. My name is Marco, and I've been a park ranger for 17 years across 5 different protected wilderness areas in the United States. I've encountered grizzly bears in Montana, seen flash floods in Arizona canyons, and survived hypothermia in the mountains of Colorado. I've tracked poachers, rescued lost hikers, and documented wildlife patterns that would make your blood run cold with wonder. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for what happened in the Monongahela National Forest during the spring of 2019. I'm writing this account now because the memories still visit me at 3 in the morning, and because I've finally accepted that staying silent makes me complicit in the lie. The official reports claimed equipment malfunction. They said the thermal imaging was corrupted. They told me my judgment was compromised by isolation and stress. But I know what I saw. I know what we all saw. And the thing is, I need people to understand that some corners of this country still hold secrets that the modern world hasn't bothered to investigate. This is not a story meant to frighten you, though it will. It's a record. It's a warning. And it's the truth as I lived it. Grafton, West Virginia sits in a pocket of the Monongahela National Forest like a wound the wilderness hasn't quite healed over. The town itself is small enough that most highway travelers miss it entirely, blinking past the weathered storefronts and the railroad tracks that once brought coal and commerce before the seams dried up. I'd worked in West Virginia before, stationed at other parks, but I'd always avoided the Grafton area. There was something about the place that unsettled the older rangers, something they wouldn't quite articulate beyond warnings to keep your head on a swivel up there. In March of that year, a promotion opportunity came through. The park needed a senior ranger to oversee a new research initiative, cataloging wildlife patterns across a 14,000-acre corridor that included some of the deepest, oldest forest in the state. The position was mine if I wanted it. It came with a modest pay increase, a private cabin, and the kind of autonomy I'd been seeking for years. I told myself the unease I felt reading the posting was just the normal anxiety of change. I didn't let myself think too hard about why the last ranger had requested a transfer after only 9 months. I drove up to meet my supervisor, Helen Pritchard, on a gray Friday in early April. The forest was just beginning to green, with that particular shade of new leaves that seems almost aggressive in its renewal. Helen was a compact woman in her 60s with silver hair pulled into a practical braid and eyes that had learned to see through evasion. She gave me the tour of the facility, the main office building, the equipment storage, the quarter-mile of covered walkway that connected everything. "You'll be living in Ranger's Cottage 7, she said, pointing through a grove of hemlocks where a modest cabin stood partially hidden. "It's remote, but that's the whole point. We need careful observation out there. The corridor's seen some unusual activity patterns." "What kind of activity?" I asked. Helen paused on the walkway, her hand resting on the weathered railing. For a moment I thought she was going to tell me something important. Instead she said, "Nocturnal movement. Some patterns we can't quite account for with traditional wildlife models. That's what we want you to help understand." She didn't mention the previous ranger's departure. She didn't mention the local rumors. I didn't ask. We were both professionals playing a careful game of mutual discretion, and I understood the rules well enough not to break them on the first day. The cabin was small but functional. 2 bedrooms, a kitchen with modern equipment, a living area with a stone fireplace, and large windows overlooking a valley that dissolved into mist and forest. A back porch held various monitoring equipment, thermal cameras, acoustic sensors, motion-triggered devices for wildlife documentation. Helen walked me through the systems during the afternoon. "We've got daily uploads to the server," she explained, showing me the wireless relay station that had been installed just before my arrival. "Everything gets backed up to the cloud simultaneously. No data loss, no excuses." Again, there was something in the way she emphasized the backup systems that made my spine tighten. It was the language of someone preparing for failure, of someone who had lost information before and didn't intend to let it happen again. By evening, Helen had returned to the main facility, leaving me alone in the cabin with mountains of documentation about the wildlife corridor. I made coffee and settled into a rhythm of reading reports from the past 2 years. The data was dense and meticulous. Thermal signatures that appeared in the forest at irregular intervals. Movement patterns that didn't match any known animal behavior. Acoustic recordings of vocalizations that the previous ranger had carefully noted but never explained. One entry, dated nearly a year before my arrival, caught my attention. The previous ranger, a man named Omar, had logged an audio file with a single note, "Unknown source, possibly equipment error, investigating further." The next entry was dated 3 weeks later, and Omar simply wrote, "Transferring to Shenandoah posting, effective immediately. There were no entries between those two notes, no explanation, no follow-up, just a clean break. I should have walked away then. That would have been the intelligent choice. But I had already signed the paperwork. The position was mine. The cabin was mine. And I had never been very good at walking away from mysteries. I made dinner and ate it watching the forest grow dark through the windows. The trees became silhouettes, then shadows, then a solid wall of black broken only by the distant glow of lights from the main facility. As I washed the dishes, I noticed movement on the thermals. Something large was moving through the corridor at 11:47 p.m., traveling from east to west through the deep forest. The system classified it as unidentified mammal, possible bear. But bears don't walk on two legs, and the thermal signature was wrong somehow. Too tall, too deliberate in its movement. I printed the data and set it aside. First night in a new job, new to the territory. The best approach was systematic observation and careful documentation. No jumping to conclusions, no paranoia. But as I lay in bed that night listening to the unfamiliar creaks of the cabin and the wind moving through the forest outside, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had known I was there, that whatever had triggered the thermal sensor had been aware of the human presence in the cabin, and had walked closer to investigate. By morning, I was certain it had been my imagination. By the end of the month, I wasn't certain of anything at all. The first week established a routine that would become the skeleton of my new life. I would wake at 6, coffee in hand by 6:15, monitoring equipment checked by 6:30. The data had accumulated overnight, always more activity than I expected. Thermal signatures moving through sections of forest where nothing should be visible to the human eye. Acoustic sensors picking up sounds that made me replay the recordings 3 and 4 times, trying to categorize what I was hearing. Most of the thermal activity occurred between midnight and 4 in the morning. Most of the acoustic evidence came from the deeper sections of the forest, the old-growth areas that had never been logged and rarely saw human intrusion. I began mapping the patterns, creating overlays in a geographic information system to see if there was a logic to the movement. There was. By the second week, it became unmistakably clear. Whatever was moving through the forest was covering territory in a deliberate pattern, moving between fixed points with the precision of a ranger conducting a survey. The creature, and I had begun to think of it that way, despite the lack of concrete evidence, seemed to be following the ridgelines and creek beds, moving through natural corridors that would have been impossible to traverse without intimate knowledge of the terrain. I attended a resource meeting with Helen and 3 other rangers in mid-April. Helen introduced me to Chloe, who managed operations for the broader park system, and Archer, a younger ranger who worked the western boundary of the preserve. The 4th attendee was introduced as Emerson, who worked for a research institution studying regional wildlife patterns. Emerson was a man in his mid-40s with sharp features and careful eyes. He wore hiking gear that looked expensive and unused, and he spoke with the precision of someone accustomed to being listened to. When Helen introduced me, Emerson's gaze held mine for just a fraction too long. "Marco," he said, extending his hand. "Helen mentioned we'd have a dedicated observer in the GRAFTON corridor. That's excellent news. We've been very interested in that particular area for some time." "What kind of research?" I asked, shaking his hand. "Wildlife behavior modeling," he said smoothly. "Predator-prey dynamics, population estimation, the usual work." He paused, and I caught something flicker across his face. A moment of candor, perhaps, or calculation. "Have you noticed anything unusual during your initial observations?" "Data's still coming in," I said. "Early to draw conclusions," Helen interjected smoothly, moving the conversation along. But I saw Emerson make a note in a small leather journal. Whatever I said would be documented elsewhere, reported to whoever had sent him. After the meeting, Archer walked with me to my truck. He was maybe 30 years old, with the weathered look of someone who'd spent years in the wilderness without complaint. "Emerson's not Park Service," he said quietly, once we were out of earshot of the building. "I don't know exactly who funds him, but it's not us. And Helen's nervous about whatever he's investigating. You might want to be careful what data you volunteer." "What's his angle?" I asked. Archer shrugged. "That's the question, isn't it? Just watch yourself. And if you see anything that doesn't fit in the system, anything that's too weird to file officially, you might want to keep it to yourself." I wanted to ask what he meant, but he was already walking toward his truck. I drove back to the cabin that afternoon in a state of heightened alertness, suddenly aware that I was part of some larger apparatus of observation and control that I didn't fully understand. The cabin felt different when I returned. The air inside seemed thicker, charged with something I couldn't quite name. I went through each room methodically, checking that nothing had been disturbed. Everything was exactly as I'd left it. The thermal monitoring equipment was undamaged and functioning normally. Yet the feeling persisted that I was not alone in the space, that something had moved through my living quarters while I was away. That night I reviewed all the thermal and acoustic data from the past 2 weeks. I cross-referenced the times of greatest activity with the weather patterns, the moon phases, the feeding patterns of local wildlife. The activity seemed independent of most environmental variables. It happened regardless of temperature, light conditions, or precipitation. It happened with a frequency that suggested a pattern independent of survival necessity. By midnight, I had a hypothesis. Whatever was moving through the forest was intelligent. Not merely animal intelligent, but something approaching the kind of logic that humans brought to movement and investigation. It was exploring. It was learning. It was establishing a territory and then methodically surveying that territory on a regular schedule. At 2:47 a.m., the thermal sensors triggered. I had begun sleeping in the office portion of the cabin, watching the equipment through the night. The signature was different this time, larger than usual, and it was moving toward the cabin. Not running, walking. Deliberate steps that covered ground with economy of motion. I watched it on the thermal screen, a bright white shape moving through the dark forest toward my position. It was approximately 6 feet tall, possibly taller. Its gait was bipedal, but not human. The arm length was wrong, extending nearly to the knees. The shoulder width was massive, far broader than any human I had ever seen. I wasn't afraid yet. I was too fascinated, too focused on documenting what I was seeing. I activated the external thermal camera, making sure the angle covered the clearing in front of the cabin. The internal monitoring showed the creature was now approximately 50 yards from the structure. Then it stopped. I watched the thermal signature remain stationary for what felt like hours, though my watch said only 3 minutes. It was facing the cabin, facing the windows, facing me. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding absurdly small in the quiet of the cabin. The thermal signature moved, not toward me but to the left, disappearing out of the sensor range. I spent the next 4 hours reviewing the footage from every angle, trying to piece together what I had seen. The external camera showed nothing but darkness and forest shadows. There was no visible form on the thermal imaging from that angle. Whatever the system had detected inside the corridor, it had no corresponding signature in the equipment pointing outward. It was as if the creature understood the location of the sensors and had remained outside their range, which was impossible. The sensors were positioned randomly, placed to cover maximum area without pattern. No animal could have deduced their locations, unless it had watched me install them, unless it had been observing long enough to understand the system. By dawn, I had convinced myself it was equipment malfunction. The thermal sensor must have been picking up anomalies. Perhaps a large animal, a moose possibly, had moved into the corridor. The gait analysis was probably incorrect due to temperature gradients in the forest. There were 1,000 rational explanations, and I would pursue them methodically. But I didn't call maintenance to check the equipment. And when night fell again, I positioned myself by the window with a thermal imaging scope and waited. Over the next 2 weeks, the creature returned 5 times. Each visit followed the same pattern. It would move through the forest, its thermal signature bright and distinct. It would approach the cabin, move to within 40 or 50 yards, and then retreat. It never attempted to enter. It never made any aggressive gestures, but it circled the cabin methodically, covering the same positions on each visit as if it were conducting a perimeter check. On May 15th, I made a decision. I would attempt to establish communication. It was foolish. Every guideline I had learned about wildlife management counseled against direct interaction with unidentified creatures. But I had spent 3 weeks watching this thing explore my territory. I had documented its patterns, calculated its movements, and analyzed its behavior. The only rational next step was to attempt contact. I waited until the evening of May 16th when the weather reports indicated clear skies and low wind. I placed a thermal tracking device, the kind we use to tag large animals for migration studies, in the clearing in front of the cabin. The device was passive, broadcasting only location and temperature readings. Then I dimmed the lights inside and waited. The creature arrived at 11:33 p.m. I watched it on the thermal imaging system as it moved toward the device. It approached slowly, carefully, lowering its massive frame to examine what I had left. For several minutes it did not move, simply observing the device from a distance. Then it picked it up. The thermal reading didn't change, which meant either the device was reading the creature's internal temperature, or it had somehow incorporated the device into its own mass. The creature straightened, the thermal signature expanding slightly as it stood to its full height. It was taller than I had initially estimated, nearly 7 feet, maybe more. The arm length was grotesquely long, extending nearly to the ankles. The chest was massive, deep and broad in a way that suggested musculature built for power rather than endurance. It turned toward the cabin, tracking device in its grip, and I could have sworn I felt its attention like a weight against the windows. Then it walked away, moving back into the forest, carrying my device with it. I didn't try to retrieve it. Instead, I packed a bag, locked the cabin, and drove to the main facility to speak with Helen. Helen's office was cold, lit by the pale glow of late afternoon filtering through vertical blinds. She listened to my account without interrupting, her expression unreadable. When I finished, she was silent for nearly a minute, studying a point on her desk between us. "Did you document this?" she finally asked. "Thermal imaging, audio recordings, tracking data. All of it's backed up to the server. Did you file any official reports?" "No. I wanted to speak with you first." Helen nodded slowly. "That was the correct choice. Let's keep it that way for now." She stood and walked to the window, pulling the blinds slightly aside to look out at the forest. "How much do you know about the history of this region?" "Nothing specific to the corridor. In 1952, a creature was spotted near Grafton. Multiple witnesses. The local newspaper covered it extensively. By the time the state authorities arrived, the thing was gone. There were footprints, very large, very strange. They were photographed and catalogued. Then the documentation disappeared." She turned back to me. "Not lost, disappeared. As in, someone collected every existing photograph and record and removed it from circulation." "What was it?" I asked. "The locals called it the Grafton monster. They said it was 7, maybe 8 feet tall, with long arms and a humanoid face, but wrong somehow. Teeth too large, eyes too far apart, movements too fluid for something that size." Helen returned to her desk and pulled out a drawer, removing a manila folder containing 3 photographs. They were grainy, taken from a distance, but unmistakably genuine. They showed massive bipedal tracks, each foot easily 20 inches long, pressed deep into soil and clay. "These are copies," Helen said, "made before the originals were seized. I've kept them because I thought someday they might matter. Turns out I was right." "Why would anyone suppress this information?" "Because certain organizations prefer the world to believe that civilization and human authority extend to every corner of the country. Because a 7-foot intelligent creature living in the national forest doesn't fit the narrative." Helen replaced the photographs. "Because some facts are considered more dangerous than the ignorance they represent." She pulled out a second folder and slid it across the desk to me. Inside were research papers, newspaper clippings from 1952 and 1953, and handwritten notes. The accounts were consistent. A large creature, humanoid but distinctly other, had been spotted multiple times in the forest. Livestock had been killed. Hikers had reported encounters. Then, abruptly, the coverage had stopped. "What happened to it?" I asked. "That depends on whether you believe the official account or the local history," Helen said. "The official story is that the creature was never real. Mass hysteria, perhaps, or misidentification of a large bear or moose. The locals said it retreated deeper into the forest and has remained there ever since, avoided by anyone sensible enough to respect its territory." "Which version do you believe?" "I believe both. I believe something real was sighted in the 1950s. I believe it survived the subsequent hunts and disappearance from public attention. I believe it remains in that corridor, and I believe it's been establishing contact with whoever monitors its territory." Helen leaned back in her chair. "The previous ranger, Omar, encountered it directly in the latter weeks of his tenure. He was not equipped to handle that level of strangeness. He requested immediate transfer and was granted it without question. The position sat vacant for 6 months. Then you applied, and it seemed like we might actually get someone who could document the phenomenon responsibly." "You set me up for this," I said. "I informed you of a posting and you applied of your own volition. Everything else has been your own observation and your own judgment. But yes, I hoped you might eventually encounter evidence of unusual wildlife behavior. That's precisely what I hired you to investigate." I stood, needing to move, to distance myself from the carefully orchestrated situation I found myself in. If you knew about this, why not study it properly? Why hide behind thermal sensors and pretend we're just monitoring normal wildlife patterns? Because the moment this information becomes public, the land becomes a resource to be extracted or exploited. The creature becomes a specimen to be studied, contained, possibly eliminated. The wilderness becomes a laboratory. I've worked in this field long enough to know that the worst thing you can do to a wild creature is open it to the scrutiny of people who view all of nature as property. So you hide it, you suppress the knowledge, and pretend it doesn't exist. I preserve its autonomy, Helen said firmly. I allow it to exist beyond the reach of classification, study, and control. And I watch for any indication that it poses a danger to humans. What if it does? I asked. Then we deal with it appropriately at that time. But suppressing knowledge of something doesn't make it less real, and hiding from that knowledge is the most dangerous approach of all. I left the office in a state of profound disturbance. Helen had essentially admitted that the Park Service was engaged in a deliberate cover-up, allowing a dangerous animal to roam without official acknowledgement, but she had framed it as preservation, as protection of something wild and beyond human understanding. The problem was, I wasn't sure if I agreed with her logic. That night I drove back to the cabin. The forest seemed different, charged with a new awareness. Everything I saw could be a threat. Everything I heard could be the approach of something vast and hungry. Every shadow held potential danger. The cabin was undisturbed. The tracking device I had left had not been returned. I reviewed the thermal data and found that the creature had approached within 20 feet of the main door at 2:15 a.m., then retreated without attempting entry. It was smart. Whatever it was learning the parameters of human behavior and response. It understood boundaries and consequences. It was testing, probing, establishing what it could and could not do in proximity to human habitation. I realized, with a sudden clarity that made my hands shake, that I was being studied, not captured or threatened, but observed and assessed, the same way I had been observing the creature. We were locked in a mutual investigation, separated only by the walls of the cabin and the invisible line between human and animal understanding. That night I did something I had not done since arriving at the posting. I called my sister Audrey in Maryland. She was a therapist, and if anyone could help me understand whether my perceptions were accurate or whether isolation and stress had begun to distort my judgment, it would be her. "Marco," she said, answering on the second ring. "What's wrong?" I told her everything. The thermal data, the creature, the approach toward the cabin, the revelation of Helen's knowledge. As I spoke, I heard how desperate and paranoid it sounded. By the time I finished, my voice was shaking. "Okay," Audrey said carefully. "Tell me this. Is it possible you're experiencing a stress reaction to isolation? New environment, unfamiliar sounds, expectation of finding something unusual?" "I have thermal imaging data," I said. "That's not perception, that's not psychology. Thermal imaging can malfunction, can be misinterpreted, can show patterns that our brains are predisposed to recognize as intentional even when they're random. A bear doesn't approach a cabin repeatedly with the same deliberate pattern. A bear doesn't circle systematically. A bear doesn't use its intelligence to remain outside sensor range. A bear does whatever a bear does," Audrey said quietly. "And a human being, alone in the dark, monitoring equipment for something strange to appear, will eventually see something strange because that's how human perception works. It's not crazy, Marco. It's neurology." But I had the photographs Helen showed me. I had the historical record of the 1952 sightings. I had 17 years of ranger experience that told me the difference between normal animal behavior and something else entirely. After I hung up with Audrey, I sat in the dark of the cabin and tried to determine the truth. By 2 a.m., I had decided on a course of action. I would stay. I would document everything. I would establish the record that could not be denied or covered up or explained away as mass hysteria. And I would do it systematically, professionally, and with the meticulous care that 17 years in the field had taught me. Whatever the creature was, I would know it. May 26th arrived with a cold front and clearing skies. The forest became more active as wildlife responded to the changing atmospheric pressure. My thermal monitoring showed 3 times the normal nocturnal movement, as if the entire ecosystem had become agitated by something beyond my perception. I had not slept in 36 hours. Coffee had become less of a beverage and more of a sustenance, supporting a body that existed only to watch and document. The cabin had become both sanctuary and trap, a place where I maintained contact with the creature while remaining protected by walls and locked doors. At 9:47 p.m., the thermal system showed unprecedented activity. multiple signatures appeared in the forest simultaneously. Not just the large creature I had been tracking, but others, smaller but still substantial in size, a family perhaps, or a gathering. They moved together toward a ridge overlooking the cabin. The main creature, the one I had begun to call the Alpha in my notes, took position at the highest point, the smaller creatures arranged on either side. The arrangement suggested hierarchy, communication, purpose. They held their positions for 40 minutes while I watched, my hands steady as I documented everything. This was what I had been waiting for. Evidence of behavior that extended beyond solitary foraging or simple territorial maintenance. Evidence of social structure, family bonds, perhaps even culture. Then, at 10:28 p.m., they began to vocalize. The sounds came through the acoustic sensors, deep, resonant calls that seemed to vibrate through the floor of the cabin. They were not animal sounds. They had structure, patterns, something approaching language, long, sustaining tones, followed by shorter, sharper calls. Responses from the smaller creatures, a conversation of some kind. And then underneath it all, I heard something else. A lower frequency, barely at the edge of hearing. It seemed to come from the earth itself, a thrumming that I could feel in my bones but could not quite perceive as sound. I made the decision to step outside. Every training, every instinct, every logical thought counseled against it. I was alone, it was dark, and there were multiple large creatures whose nature and behavior remained essentially unknown. A responsible ranger would have retreated to the vehicle and driven to the main facility for backup and guidance. I stepped onto the porch. The night was cold, far colder than the weather forecast had suggested. The sky was clear, stars impossibly bright overhead. The forest was a dark mass surrounding the small circle of the cabin, and within that darkness, shapes moved against the thermal gradients. The vocalization stopped. In that sudden silence, more profound than any quiet I had experienced before, I became aware of being observed, not by one creature but by several. I could not see them, but I could feel the attention like a weight, pressing against my skin from multiple angles. Then the Alpha emerged from the darkness. It walked down the ridge slowly, each step deliberate and careful. As it emerged into the light from the cabin windows, I saw it clearly for the first time. The creature was more human than I had expected, or perhaps more monstrous. Its face was roughly humanoid, with eyes set forward like a predator's, but they were large, luminous in the dark, reflecting the cabin light like a cat's. Its mouth was too wide, splitting the face asymmetrically, and when it opened to vocalize, I saw teeth that were far too large and far too numerous for the jaw that held them. Its body was covered in a dark fur or hair, matted in places, clean in others. The arms were indeed grotesquely long, hanging nearly to the ankles, the hands ending in claws that clicked audibly against the ground. But it was the intelligence in those eyes that struck me most forcefully. This was not an animal. This was a conscious being, assessing me, making decisions about my presence and my threat level. We stood perhaps 30 feet apart. The Alpha made a low sound, a questioning vocalization. Behind it, from the darkness, I heard movement as the smaller creatures shifted closer. I wanted to speak. I wanted to establish communication. But I had no language for this, no frame of reference that could bridge the gap between what I was and what the Alpha clearly represented. "I won't hurt you," I said, the word sounding absurdly inadequate. The Alpha's head tilted, considering. The eyes tracked my movement as I raised my hands, a gesture meant to indicate peaceful intent. It seemed to recognize the gesture. For a moment I thought it might approach further. Then, from somewhere behind the cabin, came the sound of an engine. The Alpha's entire body went rigid. The eyes that had been fixed on me suddenly tracked away, toward the road. I heard the sound more clearly then, an approaching vehicle, moving at high speed toward the cabin. The Alpha turned, and I saw something I would never forget. The creature opened its mouth wide, and there emerged a sound that was not a roar and not a scream, but something in between, a sound that carried grief and rage and warning in equal measure. It was the sound of something being driven from territory it had held since before humans had built cabins in its forest. The Alpha spun and ran, loping away on those two long limbs toward the forest. The smaller creatures scattered, disappearing into darkness. In seconds, all trace of them was gone. A truck came skidding into the clearing, tires throwing gravel. 2 Park Service vehicles pulled up behind it, the lights of their emergency beacons painting the scene in rotating blue and red. Helen stepped out of the lead truck, her face grim. She was followed by Emerson and two other men I didn't recognize, dressed in dark tactical gear that had nothing to do with Park Service operations. "Get inside," Helen said, her voice cutting through the night. I stood frozen, trying to process the sudden eruption of humanity into what had been the creature's domain. "Now, Marco." I moved, the shock overriding any sense of resistance. Helen grabbed my arm and pulled me into the cabin, slamming the door behind us. "What's happening?" I demanded. "Who are those men?" "Containment," Helen said. And for the first time since I had known her, she looked old and deeply tired. "They came from the regional office." Emerson filed a report about unusual activity in the corridor. "They came to assess the situation." "Those aren't park rangers." "No, they're from a specialized division that handles situations like this. Situations involving creatures that don't officially exist, in territories that officially don't have threats." Through the window, I watched the men fan out into the forest with equipment I recognized from tactical training: thermal targeting devices, specialized ammunition, tranquilizer components. They were preparing to hunt. "You have to stop them," I said. "The creature isn't a threat. It's intelligent. It's intelligent enough to understand that I wasn't attacking it. It was intelligent enough to understand peace. It's also large enough and powerful enough to kill a human with minimal effort," Helen said. "And now that its presence has been formally documented and reported, we have to follow protocol." "Whose protocol?" "The Park Service doesn't have protocols for creatures that don't exist." "The organization that funds the research," Helen said quietly. "The organization that keeps information about creatures like this classified and contained. They've been tracking this animal for decades. They were waiting for evidence strong enough to authorize removal." "Removal," I repeated. "You mean they're going to kill it?" "They're going to capture it if possible, kill it if necessary." I moved toward the door, but Helen stepped in front of me. "You can't stop this. You know that." "I can try, and you'll be arrested for interfering with government operations. Is that what you want?" Outside, I heard a sound from the forest. The Alpha calling again, but different this time. The call held no hope, only rage and desperation. It was a creature trapped, cornered, being driven from the only territory it had ever known. I had opened the door between human and wild. I had made contact. And in doing so, I had brought down the weight of human civilization on something that had existed perfectly well without our intervention. Helen took my arm gently. "We'll document this, we'll record their operations. It's not much, but it's what we can do." So I watched, through the windows of the cabin, as trained personnel moved through the forest with technology and weapons designed to subdue something that science officially classified as impossible. I watched the thermal equipment track the Alpha's desperate flight, circling, trying to find an escape from a net that was closing in from every direction. At one point, the creature tried to make a stand on the ridge where it had first vocalized with its family. The laser targeting systems converged. I heard a sound like a gunshot, muffled by distance but unmistakable. The Alpha staggered, then it was moving again, crashing through the underbrush with less grace than before. The second shot came minutes later, and then the third. It took them 6 hours and 8 shots to bring the creature down. By the time dawn broke, the Alpha had disappeared into a remote section of the forest corridor. The personnel began setting up motion sensor traps and tranquilizer stations, preparing for a prolonged siege. "He'll make it," Helen said, studying the maps and tracking data with grim determination. "If he's smart enough to understand human behavior, he's smart enough to find a place to hide until the pursuit exhausts its resources." But I wasn't confident of that. I had seen the wounds, the thermal signatures showing blood loss and inflammation. I had heard the sounds of pain and desperation carried back to the cabin on the night wind. That evening, Emerson came to speak with me. Helen left us alone, a courtesy I didn't appreciate. "Your documentation was excellent," Emerson said, spreading several of my thermal photographs on the table. "You captured behavioral patterns that will help us understand these creatures in ways previous researchers have never achieved." "I don't want to help you capture it," I said. "Your wants are no longer relevant," Emerson replied, his tone not unkind but utterly devoid of sympathy. "What you've documented has been classified at a level that prevents you from discussing it. The creature you encountered is now a matter of official record within specialized agencies. In exchange for that classification, you're entitled to relocation and severance. The Park Service will represent your transfer as a voluntary resignation for personal reasons. And if I don't accept those terms, you will, because the alternative is legal action for violating multiple federal confidentiality statutes, And I assure you, the government has significantly more resources for litigation than a park ranger does. He left the photographs on the table and walked out. I am writing this account from an apartment in Raleigh, North Carolina, 6 months after being relieved of my duties in the Grafton corridor. The official Park Service records list my departure as personal reasons. My severance package was substantial enough to keep me living comfortably for several years if I choose to be judicious. But I am not comfortable. I am not at peace. Every night I see the alpha's face in my mind. I remember the intelligence in those luminous eyes, the capacity for choice and decision that no mere animal possesses. I remember the sound it made when the tranquilizer darts began to take effect, a sound that carried despair and betrayal. The capture was successful, though I didn't learn that until much later. Helen contacted me through secure channels to inform me that the creature had been recovered and relocated to a research facility operated by a division of government that has no official name. It is alive, she assured me. It is being treated humanely as much as that term can apply. But it is contained, it is studied, it is an object rather than a subject, a specimen rather than a being worthy of autonomy. I don't know if this account will ever be read by anyone beyond myself. But I feel obligated to create it, to establish that what happened in that forest was real and documented and witnessed by a trained observer with no financial incentive to fabricate evidence. The Grafton monster is not a myth. The creature that was sighted in 1952, that had retreated into the deep forest and remained there through decades of human expansion and encroachment, was real. It was intelligent. It was trying to coexist peacefully with the human presence that increasingly surrounded its territory. And we destroyed that possibility because we could not resist the urge to capture and study what we did not understand. If you read this account, I ask that you consider what it means to know something exists without claiming to understand it. I ask that you consider the value of allowing wild things to remain wild, beyond our comprehension and our control. The last recorded activity at the thermal monitoring station in the Grafton corridor occurred on May 30, 2019 at 3:22 a.m. A single thermal signature, significantly smaller than the alpha, approached the cabin. It remained on the porch for 17 minutes. Then it was gone. I would like to believe it was one of the smaller creatures, returning to the place where a human had shown it kindness, to the place where its family member had been taken. I would like to believe it was a farewell of some kind, a final contact across the species barrier. I would like to believe, but I cannot know for certain. That uncertainty is the greatest horror of all. The smell hit me first. Not all at once, but in waves over 3 days. That's what I remember most clearly now, when the nightmares wake me at 3 a.m. and I sit in my kitchen with all the lights on, hands wrapped around coffee that's gone cold an hour ago. It wasn't the smell of deer carcass or bear spill. I've worked these mountains for 17 years. I know what death smells like up here. This was different, metallic, spoiled meat mixed with copper and something else. Something organic and wrong that my mind couldn't properly catalog. My name is Dakota, though most people in the small town of Ridgemont don't know that. They call me Tom, or the Ranger, or sometimes just nod when they see me at the supply store. I prefer it that way. That November started wet, unusual for the season. We'd had 30 days of rain, the kind that soaks through layers and makes the mountain paths treacherous with runoff. I was doing a standard perimeter check on the eastern ridge, routine work that I'd done hundreds of times. The preserve covers 43 square miles of protected forest, and the state required monthly patrols of the outer boundaries. Most of the work was boring, documentation, looking for illegal logging marks or poacher camps, making sure the no trespassing signs hadn't been defaced. The smell was coming from Bear Hollow, a ravine about 2 miles northeast of the main ridge trail. I recorded it in my log on November 14th. Possible carrion in Bear Hollow. Odor suggests multiple days of decomposition. We'll investigate further. The smell wasn't strong enough to indicate immediate danger, but it was persistent. I made a note to check it the next day when I had better light and could bring the proper equipment. That night I sat in my ranger station, a small prefab structure at the preserve's entrance, and reviewed the daily reports. Everything seemed normal, no hikers in violation, no vehicles attempting illegal access, just the usual autumn silence settling over the ridges. I told myself the smell was probably a deer that had gotten caught in the ravine during the heavy rains and drowned. It happened sometimes. The carrion birds and insects would clean it up within a week, but something in my gut twisted. After 17 years in these mountains, you develop an instinct. You learn to read the small signs that most people walk past without noticing. A subtle break in the bird calls, the way certain animals avoid specific areas, the quality of silence in places where silence shouldn't feel quite so heavy. The next morning, I took the North Ridge Trail toward Bear Hollow. The path narrows there, becomes almost a goat trail cutting across the steep face. I was carrying my rifle, not because I thought I'd need it, but because you always carry it in bear country, and these mountains still had bears. I also had my canteen, a full field kit, and my phone, though cell service was spotty that far out. The smell grew stronger as I approached the hollow. Unmistakably organic, unmistakably meat, but still that wrong quality underneath it. Sharp and acrid in a way I couldn't place. I remember pausing at the ridge's edge, looking down into the ravine below. The morning light hadn't reached that deep into the gorge yet. The bottom was still in shadow. That's when I noticed the birds. There were no birds. That was the first real sign something was wrong. That time of year, the ridges should be alive with movement. Chickadees, nuthatches, the occasional jay. But that entire side of the mountain was silent. Dead air silent. The kind of silence that makes your inner ear feel pressurized. I descended carefully. The rocks were slick with moss and recent rain. My boots found purchase on the steeper sections, and I kept one hand on the cliff face for stability. The smell intensified as I dropped into the ravine itself. It was thick now, coating the back of my throat. I pulled my bandana up over my nose, though it didn't help much. The carcass was about 40 yards into the hollow, caught in a tangle of deadfall at the ravine's lowest point. At first, I couldn't process what I was looking at. My mind kept trying to match it against known categories: deer, black bear, even a mountain lion, though we haven't had confirmed cougar sightings in this region for over 100 years. But the shape was wrong for all of them. The size was wrong. The way the bones were arranged was wrong. It was large, much larger than a deer. The skeletal structure suggested something bipedal, which my conscious mind immediately rejected. No large bipedal animals lived in these mountains. Not anymore, not for centuries. But the bones I was looking at were thick and dense, with heavy articulation points at the joints. The skull was partially exposed where the carrion birds, and whatever else, had done their work. The jaw was disproportionately wide. I forced myself to approach it despite every instinct screaming at me to leave. The remains were advanced in decomposition. Maggots were still active in the deeper tissues, which meant the death had occurred within the last 2 to 3 weeks. The bones showed signs of trauma, deep breaks and fractures that suggested either a catastrophic fall or something else. Something I didn't want to consider. What struck me most was the pattern of the bones. They weren't scattered randomly as they would have been if the animal had fallen and died. They were arranged, deliberate, as if something had positioned them after the fact. I've seen predator kills. I've seen animals that have been caught and torn apart. This was different. This was organized. Ritualistic, almost. I took photographs with my phone, marking the location on my GPS. My hands were shaking. I told myself it was the cold. The temperature was dropping as the sun climbed. The wind in the ravine carried a sharp bite. But I knew it wasn't the cold. The smell suddenly intensified. Waves of it. Rotten meat and that metallic undertone so strong I gagged. I backed away from the carcass, my eyes watering. That's when I realized something. The smell was getting stronger in real time. Not from the old decomposition, but from something fresh. The sound came next. A low croaking cry from deeper in the ravine, from the shadows where the sun still hadn't reached. It wasn't a bird. It wasn't anything I'd ever heard before. I was out of that ravine in minutes, moving as carefully as I could without actually running. Once I reached the ridge trail, I kept walking fast, my back prickling with the sensation of being watched. I didn't look back. That evening I filed a report with the park headquarters in the state capital. I described finding a large animal carcass of undetermined species in Bear Hollow and noted that the remains showed signs of unusual trauma. I marked it as a priority token's name and low issue, though my hands were still shaking as I typed. They told me to document it further and that someone might come out for an official analysis once the weather cleared. Nobody came for 2 weeks. During those 2 weeks, things began to change in the forest. I noticed it first on my routine supply run to Ridgemont. The animals in town, the dogs chained outside the feed store, the cats that usually lounged on the porches of the main street, they were nervous, skittish. Mrs. Chen, who runs the general store, mentioned that her rabbit hutches had been breached twice in 1 week. No animals had gotten in, but the rabbits were in such a panic they'd hurt themselves trying to escape. The hutch's latches had been tampered with, not broken, just opened. Probably just a possum or a coon, I told her, but I could hear the uncertainty in my own voice. The sounds started the 3rd week of November. They came from the deep forest, from the parts of the preserve where the ridges narrow into canyons and the ravines become so deep that even the summer sun only touches them for a few hours. The sounds were at night mostly, a croaking, rasping call that echoed through the valleys. Not a bird, not an animal I could identify. It would come in waves, a low utterance that seemed to vibrate up through the earth itself, followed by a high-pitched screech that made your teeth ache. The other rangers started mentioning it. There were only 3 of us on the preserve, myself, Garrett, and a newer kid named Marcus. Garrett was 62 and had been doing this for nearly as long as I had. He took the Southern Patrol, mostly working the main trails and the areas where tourists were allowed. Marcus, barely 24, covered the western sections and usually worked the information booth at the entrance. You hearing those sounds? Garrett asked me on November 22nd when we passed in the parking lot. Yeah, I said. I've been trying to figure out what they are. They're wrong, Garrett said simply. He wasn't a man who spooked easily, but there was something in his face, a tightness around the eyes. I worked predator control down in Georgia for 5 years before I came up here. That ain't any animal I know. Could be something migrating through, I said, not believing it even as I said it. Wind patterns change. Sometimes animals get displaced. Maybe, Garrett said, but he didn't sound convinced. The smell never left. It would fade some days, almost disappear completely, then come back stronger than before. It drifted across different parts of the preserve in waves, as if something was moving through the forest, leaving a trail of stench in its wake. By the last week of November, I knew I had to go back to Bear Hollow. The remains I'd found had been there for at least 3 weeks by that point. Decomposition in the cold autumn temperatures would have slowed, but the carcass should still be visible, more skeletal perhaps. I needed to see if anything had changed, if anything or anyone had disturbed the site. But I didn't want to go alone. I asked Marcus if he'd accompany me on a full-range inventory check of the Eastern Preserve. It was a legitimate operational task, and it gave me cover for spending time in Bear Hollow. Marcus was young and eager, still in that phase where he wanted to prove himself. He didn't ask many questions. We planned for an early start on November 28th. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in my ranger station and listened to the sounds coming from the forest. They were closer than before, more frequent, and underneath the croaking calls, I started to hear other things, movements through the brush that were too large and too purposeful to be normal forest fauna. Something moving through the darkness with intention. Around 2 a.m. I heard it outside my station, not the call but actual movement. Footsteps, heavy footsteps in the gravel parking lot. I stood and looked out the window, my hand on my rifle. Nothing was there, but the gravel showed disturbance. Large, deep impressions as if something very heavy had walked in slow circles around my building. The impressions were too broad to be human, too far apart. I locked the doors and kept the lights on all night. By morning, I'd convinced myself it was a bear, a large one passing through. Bears sometimes exhibited odd behavior. They could seem almost human-like in their movements if you weren't paying full attention. Shadows played tricks in the dark, but when I examined the tracks in daylight, that explanation fell apart. The impressions were vaguely foot-like, but the spacing and depth were wrong for any bear I'd ever encountered. And there were claw marks, but not like any claw mark I knew. Not the splayed, deliberate punctures of a predator. These were thin, precise, and deeply gouged into the ground. Marcus arrived at 7 a.m. with his equipment bag and a thermos of coffee. He was bright, cheerful, completely oblivious to the wrongness that had settled over the preserve like a physical thing. "Beautiful morning," he said, looking at the sunrise over the ridges. "Should be a good day for the perimeter check." "Yeah," I agreed, not telling him what I'd found in the parking lot. "Let's get moving." The hike to Bear Hollow took us 3 hours instead of the usual 2. The trails were in poor condition from the recent rains and freeze-thaw cycles. Sections of the main path had eroded away completely, forcing us to make detours through thicker brush. I noticed that the forest seemed reluctant to let us pass. Fallen branches blocked the way at odd angles. Thorny vines seemed to have grown directly across the trail since my last passage through, and the animals were gone, completely gone. No birds, no small mammals rustling in the brush, no signs of life at all, just us moving through an empty forest. The silence was oppressive, not the clean, peaceful silence of a winter day in the mountains, but something else, something expectant. "It's quiet," Marcus said around the 1 hour mark. "Really quiet." "Seasons changing," I told him. "Animals bed down, migrate out." "Yeah, but there should be winter residents, chickadees, nuthatches." He paused. "You know what I mean." I did know what he meant. This wasn't normal seasonal quiet. The smell hit us around the 2 hour mark. Marcus noticed it first, stopping on the trail and tilting his head. "What is that?" he asked. "Probably the carcass I reported," I said. "Large animal died in Bear Hollow. I documented it on the 15th. We're going to do a full analysis while we're in the area." Marcus nodded, but he pulled his jacket tighter and picked up his pace slightly. We reached Bear Hollow around 10:30 a.m. The ravine looked different in the late fall morning light, less threatening somehow, more just a natural feature of the landscape. But that false sense of security evaporated as soon as we approached the edge. The bones were gone. Where the carcass had been, caught in the tangle of deadfall in the ravine's lowest section, there was nothing. No bones, no scattered remains, no evidence that anything had ever been there. "Are you sure this is the right spot?" Marcus asked. I checked my GPS. The coordinates matched exactly. This was the location. I looked around at the deadfall, the arrangement of logs and branches. Everything was exactly as I remembered except for the carcass itself. "It was here," I said. "Maybe you got the location wrong?" There was an edge of doubt in Marcus's voice. "Or maybe the coyotes dragged it off. Or, I have GPS coordinates," I said more sharply than I intended. "This is exactly where I found it." I examined the area more carefully. The ground was disturbed. Soil had been churned up. There were drag marks leading away from the deadfall, into the deeper shadows of the ravine, marks that looked like something very large had been pulled through the brush. But something else caught my eye. In the soft soil at the ravine's edge there were footprints, not human footprints, not animal prints. Something in between. They were large, nearly 18 inches long, I'd estimate, 5-toed with what looked like claws or very thick nails at the ends of each digit. The weight distribution suggested bipedal movement, but the shape was wrong for human feet. The angles were alien. The spacing and the depth of the impressions indicated something far heavier than a human carrying the weight in a very different way than any human could. "What are those?" Marcus whispered. "Don't know," I said. My mouth had gone dry. "Could be." The smell hit us, all at once, overwhelming. Rotten meat and copper and something else, something acrid and burning that made your eyes water. We both gagged. It was coming from the ravine, from the deeper sections where the sunlight never reached. That's when we heard it, the croaking call, but closer than I'd ever heard it before. Underneath it, something else. Breathing. Heavy, labored breathing, almost like a bellows. The sound of something very large drawing oxygen through tissues that shouldn't exist. "We need to go," I said, grabbing Marcus's arm. "Now." "What is that?" he asked. He was pale beneath his tan, eyes wide. "What the fuck is that?" "Doesn't matter. We're leaving." I pulled him away from the ravine's edge, back toward the main trail. We didn't run. Running would have been worse, would have triggered something in the predatory part of whatever was in that ravine. But we moved fast, deliberately, with purpose. The sounds followed us. Not physically, not at first. The breathing and the croaking were still coming from the ravine, echoing off the rocks and traveling through the forest like the creature was speaking to the mountains themselves. But there was movement in the trees to our left, parallel to our path, something large moving through the underbrush with terrible purpose. I didn't look. I kept my eyes on the trail ahead and kept pulling Marcus along. His breath was coming in short, panicked gasps. "What is it?" he kept asking. "What is it? What is it?" "Don't stop. Don't look back. Keep moving." We made it back to the main trail and picked up our pace. The parallel movement in the trees didn't stop, but it seemed to fall behind, as if whatever was out there was content to follow rather than engage. I was grateful for that. Grateful and terrified in equal measure. It took us 2 hours to get back to the ranger station. Marcus didn't speak much during the walk, and I was too focused on not falling apart to make conversation. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. My vision kept going slightly blurry. I recognized the signs of profound shock, but there was nothing I could do to stop it. When we got back to the station, Marcus sat down on the bench outside and just stared at nothing for a solid 20 minutes. Finally, he stood up and went to his car. "I'm filing a report with headquarters," he said. His voice was hollow. "I'm telling them something is wrong out here. Something is very wrong. Tell them the carcass is missing," I said. "Tell them there are unidentified prints in Bear Hollow. Tell them we heard vocalizations we couldn't identify. I'm telling them that whatever is in those mountains is real and it's dangerous," Marcus said. He looked at me directly for the first time since we'd left the ravine. "You know what that is, don't you? You know what we found." I didn't answer. I couldn't answer. Because what I knew, what I'd been trying to deny since finding those first bones, was something that couldn't be acknowledged without admitting that the world was fundamentally more wrong than I'd ever believed. Marcus left the station a few minutes later. I watched him drive down the mountain road toward town, his car disappearing around the curve that would take him toward Ridgemont and toward a phone where he could call authorities and tell them that the impossible was occurring in the forest. I never saw Marcus again. The official report says he drove his car off Mill Road about 6 miles from the preserve entrance. They found the vehicle 2 days later, wrapped around a tree at the bottom of a ravine. Marcus was still in the car. The police said the impact was catastrophic, that the vehicle must have been going extremely fast to suffer that much damage. The assumption was that he'd either fallen asleep at the wheel or intentionally driven himself off the road. I knew better. The sound started that night, directly outside my ranger station, not in the distance, not parallel to my location. Right there, outside the small prefab building, circling it slowly. The breathing sounds, the croaking calls, and underneath it all, something else. Sounds like speech, almost. Words in a language that predated human language. Sounds that your vocal cords shouldn't be able to produce. It circled for 3 hours. I sat at my desk with my rifle loaded and my phone in my hand. The cell service was unusable. Every time I tried to call out, I got nothing but static. The radio was the same. I was completely cut off. The creature, because I couldn't keep calling it anything else, couldn't keep pretending I didn't know what was out there. The creature tested the doors and windows, not roughly, not like something just investigating, but methodically, testing the locks, testing the structural integrity of the frame, testing whether it could get inside. It couldn't. The station was built to withstand weather and minor predator encounters. The doors and windows held, but around midnight I heard something that made my blood freeze even colder than it already was. It knocked on the door. Not an attack, not a violent strike, a knock. 3 deliberate, measured taps on the frame, as if the creature was asking for entry. I made a decision in that moment. I picked up my rifle, walked to the door, and opened it. There was nothing there. The parking lot was empty. The forest beyond was silent. There was no sign of movement, no indication that anything had been at my door seconds before. But the smell rolled in, overwhelming and acrid, and in the beam of my flashlight, I could see something in the gravel parking lot. Footprints, dozens of them, circling the building, walking right up to the door, walking away, coming back. The same large, impossible footprints that had been outside my station weeks before. But there was something new. In the gravel directly in front of the door, arranged with careful deliberation, were the remains of birds, dozens of them, small bodies, some still intact, some torn apart with obvious premeditation, arranged in a pattern that almost looked like words if you stared at them long enough. It was a gift, or a threat, or both. I locked the door, backed away from it slowly, and sat in the darkest corner of the station with my rifle across my knees. I spent the rest of the night that way, listening to the sounds from the forest, the breathing that never seemed to stop, the croaking calls that changed in pitch and tone as if the creature was speaking directly to me, telling me things in a language I couldn't comprehend but understood on some ancient primitive level. By dawn, the sounds had stopped. The smell had faded to almost nothing, but I knew it was still out there, waiting, watching. Garrett came by the station the next morning on his regular patrol. He found me in a state, still in my clothes from the day before, unshaven, with dark circles under my eyes. "You look like hell," he said. "Bad night," I told him. "Sound and movement in the forest, something testing the perimeter." Garrett's expression went flat. "The thing that took the bones." It wasn't a question. "You know what it is," he said, not asking, stating. "I know what the legends say it is," I replied carefully. "The Wendigo." Garrett said it like he was confirming something he'd always known. "That's what people used to call it, before the reservations. before everyone agreed to pretend that the mountains didn't have anything older and meaner than bears living in them. Wendigo is a legend, I said, but my voice was hollow. So are a lot of things, until you meet one, Garrett said. I knew my grandfather. He was from the reservation down in Tennessee. He used to tell stories about the hunger, about the old things that lived in the mountains before humans came, about what happened to people who went too far into the forest. Those are stories, I said. They're warnings, Garrett countered, and warnings usually come from experience. He paused. Marcus called me last night, told me what he saw, told me what you saw. Then I didn't hear from him again until the state police called saying they found his car in a ravine. He must have lost control, I said. Did he? Garrett looked at me with something like pity. Or was he trying to get away from something and just didn't try hard enough? I had no answer to that. You should leave, Garrett said. Quit, transfer, get out of these mountains while you still can. I can't do that, I said. This is my job. This is where that thing lives, Garrett said flatly. And it's hungry. It's always hungry. The hunger is what defines it. That's what the old stories say. That's what my grandfather told me. It feeds because it has to feed, because the hunger is the thing that exists at the center of what it is. And right now it's aware of you. How do you know it's aware of? Because I've seen the signs, Garrett said. He pulled off his jacket. On his left arm from wrist to elbow were gouges, deep gouges that looked like claw marks, but impossible claw marks. They weren't fresh, they were scarred, several weeks old, but they were clearly deliberate, clearly made by something with large claws and the understanding of how to use them. What happened? I asked. About 3 months ago, before the heavy rains, I was checking a section of fence along the northern boundary. Something came at me out of nowhere, so fast I didn't have time to think. It was just there, and I was bleeding before I even realized I'd been attacked. He pulled his jacket back on. I ran. I made it to my vehicle and drove straight to the emergency room in town. I told them I got caught on some barbed wire. They didn't question it much. Why didn't you report it? I asked. Why didn't you tell headquarters? Because they wouldn't have believed me, Garrett said, and because I knew what had happened, and I knew that if I reported it, headquarters would either think I was crazy or they'd send up some kind of response team, and a response team would only make it angrier. It's already angry, I said. It killed Marcus. Did it? Garrett asked, or did it just leave him a way out? Maybe Marcus was smart enough to take it. He walked toward the door. I'm transferring. I'm putting in my resignation tomorrow. I'm leaving the mountains. You should too, Dakota, while you can still drive a car in a straight line. I didn't leave. I don't know why. Fear might have paralyzed me. Or stubbornness. Or maybe some part of me needed to understand what was happening. Needed to find some rational explanation for the irrational things occurring in my mountains. The next week, I went back to Bear Hollow alone. It was a stupid decision. Looking back now, it was one of the stupidest things I've ever done. But I was haunted by questions. Where had the bones gone? How was something that large moving through the forest without leaving significant evidence? What was it eating if it had taken the original carcass? The hike-in was tense. Every step felt like trespassing. The forest was watching. I could feel it in the pressure of the air, in the wrongness of the silence. The birds still weren't present. The small animals hadn't returned. It was just me and the trees and the terrible sense that something very large was aware of my presence. I descended into Bear Hollow alone, moving carefully along the ravine's edge. The smell was back, even worse than before. Rotten meat and copper and something underneath it like spoiled fat and burning hair. The arrangement of logs and deadfall where I'd first found the carcass looked disturbed. Logs had been moved, new paths had been created through the debris, paths that were obviously used regularly. Paths made by something very heavy. That's when I noticed the bones, not the large carcass I'd first found, but smaller bones scattered across the ravine floor. Deer bones mostly. Some with fresh gouges where flesh had been torn away. Some showing signs of having been deliberately broken, the marrow sucked out with precision. These were kills. Multiple kills. Recent kills. The predator pattern was obvious. The Wendigo, and I'd stopped trying to call it anything else, was hunting. It was moving through the forest, finding prey, bringing it here to feed. The ravine was a feeding ground. I examined the bones more closely, trying to estimate how many animals had been killed. 20, 30, maybe more, all within the last few weeks. That's a lot of meat for one animal, even a large one, especially during the season when smaller prey should be scarce, unless it wasn't hunting for sustenance. unless the hunger Garrett had mentioned was something deeper, something that couldn't be satisfied by regular feeding. I was so focused on the bones that I didn't notice the marks on the cliff face until I was almost on top of them. Claw marks, deep gouges in the stone, hundreds of them arranged in what looked almost like patterns. I ran my hand across them, feeling the depth. These weren't fresh. Some looked years old, maybe decades, a history written in stone. And then I saw something that made my blood freeze. Names, carved into the rock. Human names, crude and desperate, some deep enough to have penetrated inches into the stone. Michael, Sarah, Thomas, Jenny, dozens of names, some old enough that lichen had begun to cover them, some relatively fresh, the carved letters still showing raw stone underneath. These were people. People who had come into this ravine, people who had encountered the thing that lived here, people who hadn't left. I scrambled backward, my boots slipping on loose stone. I caught myself against the cliff face, my breath coming in ragged gasps. This was a grave, not a burial site, but a grave in the sense that people had died here, left messages here, left evidence of their existence before they ended. That's when I heard it. The sound was different from the croaking calls I'd heard before. It was more structured, more deliberate, almost like speech. The creature was somewhere in the upper sections of the ravine, beyond the shadows where the sunlight never reached, and it was vocalizing, calling to me. I should have run. Every survival instinct I had was screaming at me to get out of that ravine, get back to the main trail and keep going until I was out of the mountains entirely, but I couldn't move. The calling grew louder, more insistent. The sound of breathing that didn't sound like breathing, a wet, rasping inhalation like lungs that were never meant to process air. The smell intensified until I was gagging, and then slowly shapes began to coalesce in the shadows of the upper ravine. It was tall, impossibly tall, nearly 10 feet, maybe taller. The shape was vaguely humanoid but wrong in every way. The proportions were distorted, limbs too long, too articulated. The head was disproportionately large, with angles that didn't match any skull I'd ever seen. The skin, if you could call it that, looked like pulled leather, gray-white, and stretched tight over a frame that was clearly far larger underneath. There were no eyes that I could see, just dark hollows in the skull. No mouth as such, but a gaping hole where the jaw should be. A void that seemed deeper than it should be possible. The smell came off it in waves. The reek of spoiled meat and something else, something acidic that burned the inside of your nose. It stood there unmoving, just watching me with those empty eye sockets. I realized that it didn't need eyes. It could sense me. It knew exactly where I was and what I was feeling, and it was hungry. The hunger was a physical thing in that ravine. It pressed down on me like weight, like something trying to crush me through sheer force of presence. The hunger was the entire point of the creature's existence. It was what defined it. It was what it was. I was prey, and prey was what it hunted. I ran up the ravine toward daylight, slipping and scrambling on loose stone, my hands and knees taking damage that I didn't feel in that moment. Behind me I could hear it coming, not fast. It didn't need to be fast. It had patience. It had all the time in the world. The sounds it was making were the most terrifying thing I'd ever heard. A combination of the breathing and the croaking and something underneath it that might have been laughter or might have been the sound of hunger made manifest. It was everything that primal fear is based on. The knowledge that you are in the presence of something older than human civilization, something that had been hunting prey since before humans existed. I made it out of the ravine and onto the main trail. The forest suddenly came alive. The silence that had been oppressive broke like a dam. Birds erupted from the trees around me, fleeing in the same direction I was running. Squirrels and rabbits scattered across the path. Even the trees seemed to be trying to get out of my way, branches whipping aside as if propelled by their own will. Everything that could move was moving. Everything that shared this forest with the creature was fleeing. I ran for 3 miles. My lungs burned. My legs felt like they would give out with every step. But I didn't stop. Fear is a powerful drug, and it kept me moving long past the point where my body should have given out. When I finally collapsed near the ranger station, I'd lost track of time. The sun was lower in the sky than it should have been. It had taken me less time to run down from the ravine than it had taken me to hike up, or maybe I'd run in circles. I wasn't entirely sure of where I was when I finally stopped. I lay on the ground behind the ranger station and threw up until there was nothing left. My hands were scraped raw, my knees were bleeding, I'd torn my jacket, my entire body was shaking, but I was alive. The question was how long that would remain true. That night, I called the state police. I told them that I'd discovered evidence of multiple missing persons in Bear Hollow, that there were names carved into the rock there, that there were remains of numerous animals, that there was clear indication that something was using the ravine as a feeding ground. The state police sent a unit out the next morning. 2 officers, both young, both skeptical of my claims. I led them to Bear Hollow, but when we arrived, the names were gone, completely gone. The cliff face where I'd seen them carved so clearly had been sanded smooth. The stones still bore the scars of the original gouges, but the names were unreadable. Just marks, nothing coherent. The bones were gone too. Only a few scattered remains, the kind of thing that could be easily explained away. Predator activity, nothing unusual. You sure this is where you saw it? One of the officers asked, his skepticism now openly displayed. I'm sure, I said, but I didn't know if I was sure anymore. Everything was shifting. Everything I'd seen was becoming uncertain. Could be bears, the other officer said, or coyotes. Nothing here that points to missing persons. I knew better. I knew what I'd seen, but I also knew that what I'd seen didn't want to be found. It had cleaned up after itself, removed the evidence, made it so that what I was describing sounded like the ravings of someone who'd spent too much time alone in the mountains. The officers left, and I was alone again. That night it came for me, not in the distant forest, not circling outside the station, but in my dreams. I found myself in Bear Hollow, standing in the center of the ravine with the creature looming over me. But in the dream it was worse because I could understand it. I could comprehend what it was and what it meant. It was older than the mountains. It had been here for thousands of years, maybe longer. It had fed on the creatures of the forest and on the humans who ventured too far into the wilderness. It was primal hunger made flesh, an embodiment of the need to consume, to feed, to continue its existence through the consumption of others. And it wanted me to understand something. The hunger wasn't evil. That was a human concept. The creature wasn't malevolent. It was simply what it was. A predator, a consumer, a force of nature. And the reason it was manifesting now, making itself known, leaving traces and signs and evidence of its existence, was because something had changed, something had awakened it. I woke up screaming, my clothes drenched in sweat despite the cold room. The dream faded quickly, but the sense of understanding remained. I knew things I shouldn't have known. I understood patterns in its behavior that made terrible sense. The heavy rains that started the season, the flooding of Bear Hollow, those things had disturbed something in the ravine, some hibernation or dormancy. It had been sleeping, and we had woken it up, and now it was awake, and it was hungry. Garrett left the mountains on December 8th. I saw him in town 2 days before he transferred. He looked older than he had when I'd last seen him. The scratches on his arm were gone, fully healed into faint white scars. He'd aged 10 years in as many weeks. Don't stay, he said when he saw me at the supply store. Whatever reason you think you have to stay, it's not worth it. I'm doing my job, I told him. Your job is finished, he replied. There's nothing to document here anymore, nothing to report, just a forest that doesn't want you in it. If I leave, who monitors the preserve? Who watches for that thing? Garrett finished. Let it live its life. Let it hunt. It was here long before the preserve was established. It'll be here long after we're gone. The best thing we can do is not interfere. It killed Marcus, I said. Maybe, Garrett said. Or maybe Marcus made a choice. I've been thinking about it a lot. About how desperate his last phone call sounded. About how that's one less person it has to hunt. One less witness to what exists in these mountains. I didn't know how to respond to that. Garrett left that afternoon. I watched his truck drive down the mountain road toward the town, and I knew I'd never see him again. Marcus's funeral was held on December 11th. I attended, partly out of obligation, partly out of a desperate need to maintain some sense of normalcy. His parents were there, his mother crying softly, his father stone-faced. They thanked me for my service to the park system. They thanked everyone for coming. It was a small, quiet funeral for a young man whose life had ended in a ravine. What they didn't know was that Marcus had probably chosen that end. What they didn't know was that sometimes when you see what truly exists in this world, when you understand how little of human experience you've actually perceived, the desire to keep living can diminish. That's when I started understanding what the creature wanted. Not my death. That would have been simple. That would have been the end. No, what it wanted was for me to stay, to witness, to know, to live with the knowledge of its existence. The creature was a parasite not of flesh but of consciousness. It fed on fear, yes, but more than that, it fed on the knowledge that someone knew it was real. It fed on the desperate attempt to communicate something that no one would believe. It was the isolation that was the real hunger. The isolation of being the only one who knew the truth. The signs became more frequent in December, carved into the trees near the ranger station, symbols that looked almost like language but weren't. Messages that seemed to contain meaning but slipped away from understanding the moment you tried to focus on them. Animals began to appear, left at my doorstep. Deer with deep claw marks. Bears that had been torn apart with surgical precision. Birds arranged in patterns, just as they had been before. The message was always the same. I'm here. I'm real. You know? By mid-December, I realized I couldn't stay. But I also couldn't leave, because if I left, I'd be free. I'd be outside the mountains, away from the thing that hunted there. But I'd also be alone with the knowledge. Alone with the weight of what I'd seen. So instead I requested a transfer to the Central Command Office in the capital. Administrative work, paperwork, a job that would still keep me connected to the preserve without requiring me to be in the forest. The transfer was approved quickly, too quickly. As if someone, somewhere, wanted me as far away from the mountains as possible while still remaining part of the system. On December 28th, I packed my belongings from the ranger station. I loaded my truck. I drove down the mountain one last time. As I was passing the entrance to the preserve, I saw it, standing at the tree line, partially hidden in shadow, was a figure. Large, impossibly tall, the same creature I'd seen in Bear Hollow, but somehow more solid now, more real. It stood perfectly still, watching me drive past, and I understood in that moment that it was satisfied. I had witnessed. I had survived. I would carry the knowledge with me for the rest of my life. I would be the hunger's messenger, whether I wanted to be or not. I moved to the capital city. I got an apartment. I got a desk job processing permit applications and maintenance requests for a system of preserves across 3 states. Normal work, normal life. But at night I hear the sounds, the croaking calls, the breathing, the voice that almost sounds like speech but isn't quite. They follow me here, across the distances, through the concrete and glass of the city. The smell sometimes reaches me too, carried on wind that shouldn't be able to penetrate these buildings. I started having the dreams again, different dreams. In these dreams, I'm back in Bear Hollow. The creature is there, and it's showing me things. Images of the past, the forest in a different age. Hunters moving through the trees on foot, in groups, with respect for the things that lived in the darkness. Rituals designed to keep the balance, ways of coexisting with the hunger. And I understand in these dreams that the creature isn't evil. It's part of an ecosystem that humans broke when we started thinking we could control nature. We poisoned the streams. We cut down the old growth. We forgot the respect that was necessary. The creature isn't a monster. It's what happens when a system is pushed too far out of balance. 2 weeks ago, I received a letter. No postage, no return address. It was placed on my car windshield in the apartment parking lot. It was written in someone's handwriting, shaky, desperate, the hand of someone who was terrified, but I couldn't recognize whose hand it was. It said, "Help me. I'm still alive. It keeps me alive. It feeds but never kills. Never quite. Just takes pieces and lets me heal. I have been in the hollow for so long, years. I don't remember my name anymore, but I remember you. I remember you running. Please, do not come back. It will want to keep you too. And staying alive here is worse than death." The names carved in the stone, those are the lucky ones. Those are the ones it decided to end quickly. I am not lucky. The hunger is patient. The hunger is eternal. And it is so very, very lonely. The letter wasn't signed. I've thought about that letter every day since. I've wondered who wrote it. How many people are still alive in the ravine, kept in some state of suspended suffering, feeding the creature's hunger in ways that go beyond the physical. I've thought about going back, but I can't. Because I understand now what Garrett meant when he said to let it live its life. Because interfering would only make things worse. Because some things exist in the world that aren't meant to be understood or stopped, only to be given space to exist. I still work at the office processing permits and applications. No one knows what I know. No one sees what I see in the data. The patterns of missing persons in areas near the preserve. The wildlife reports that don't quite add up. The recommendations from rangers that the eastern sections be closed due to environmental sensitivity. They're trying to protect people. Not from the creature, they don't know about that, but from something, from the understanding that there are forces in this world that are older and stronger and more real than anything we've built. The mountains are still there. The preserve still operates. Rangers still come and go. Some of them make it their whole career. Some of them leave after a few months, citing vague reasons, job dissatisfaction, family reasons, better opportunities elsewhere. But some of them don't leave. Some of them stay in the forest longer than their shifts require. Some of them request the most isolated, dangerous assignments, and eventually they disappear into the data as missing persons or tragic accidents. I wonder if they're like me, if they've seen something in those mountains that changed them, if they're trying to find their way back to the hunger, now that they know it exists. The last time I heard the sounds, they were different. Not a creature calling from the mountains, but something closer. In my apartment, in the walls, in the spaces between spaces. A message. It was saying, you are still part of me. You will always be part of me. And when you finally understand that hiding in this city changes nothing, you know where to find me. I do know where to find it. And every day I get closer to understanding that maybe I should. The hunger in the Alpaca Mountains is not the only hunger in this world. There is a hunger in knowledge, the hunger to understand what is real. There is a hunger in fear, the need to face what terrifies us. There is a hunger in isolation, the need to connect with something, anything, even if that something is a force beyond comprehension. I am Dakota, a park ranger in the Alpaca Mountains. I work in an office now, but my soul is still in the forest, and I'm still learning, every single day, what it means to have been touched by something older and darker than humanity. The creature in Bear Hollow is waiting. I wonder how much longer I can stay away. I wonder how much longer I should try to stay away. The mountains are calling, and the hunger is patient, and sooner or later, all of us who know the truth will answer that call.